Part 3 of 3 of The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath by H.P. Lovecraft. Narrated by Kairos of the Threefold Manifold. October 22nd, 2024. So at length, Carter crawled through endless burrows with 3 helpful ghouls bearing the slate gravestone of Colonel Nepemiah Derby, obit 1719. From the Charter Street burying ground in Salem. When they came again into open twilight, they were in a forest of vast, lichened monoliths, reaching nearly as high as the eye could see, and forming the modest gravestones of the Gugs. On the right of the hole out of which they wriggled, and seen through aisles of monoliths, was a stupendous vista of cyclopean round towers mounting up illimitable into the gray air of inner earth. This was the great city of the Gugs, whose doorways are 30 feet high. Ghouls come here often, for a buried Gug will feed a community for almost a year, and even with the added peril, it is better to burrow for Gugs than to bother with the graves of men. Carter now understood the occasional tightened bones he had felt beneath him in the Vale of Panoth. Straight ahead, and just outside the cemetery, rose a sheer perpendicular cliff, at whose base an immense and forbidding cavern yawned. This the ghouls told Carter to avoid as much as possible, since it was the entrance to the unhallowed vaults of Zen, where Gugs hunt ghasts in the darkness. And truly, that warning was soon well justified. For the moment a ghoul began to creep toward the towers to see if the hour of the Gug's resting had been rightly timed, there glowed in the gloom of that great cavern's mouth first one pair of yellowish-red eyes, and then another, implying that the Gugs were 1 century less, and that ghasts have indeed an excellent sharpness of smell. So the ghoul returned to the burrow and motioned his companions to be silent. It was best to leave the ghasts to their own devices, and there was a possibility that they might soon withdraw, since they must naturally be rather tired after coping with a Gug sentry in the black vaults. After a moment, something about the size of a small horse hopped out into the gray twilight, and Carter turned sick at the aspect of that scabrous and unwholesome beast, whose face is so curiously human despite the absence of a nose, a forehead, and other important particulars. It proved that they had not fought the Gug sentry at all, but had merely slipped past him as he slept, so that their strength and savagery were still unimpaired, and would remain so till they had found and disposed of a victim. It was very unpleasant to see those filthy and disproportioned animals, which soon numbered about 15, grubbing about and making their kangaroo leaps in the gray twilight, where tightened towers and monoliths arose, but it was still more unpleasant when they spoke among themselves in the coughing gutturals of ghasts. And yet, horrible as they were not so horrible as what presently came out of the cave after them with disconcerting suddenness. It was a paw, fully 2 feet and a half across, and equipped with formidable talons. After it came another paw, and after that a great black-furred arm to which both of the paws were attached by short forearms. Then 2 pink eyes shone, and the head of the awakened Gug sentry, large as a barrel, wobbled into view. The eyes jutted 2 inches from each side, shaded by bony protuberances overgrown with coarse hairs. But the head was chiefly terrible because of the mouth. That mouth had great yellow fangs and ran from the top to the bottom of the head, opening vertically instead of horizontally. But before that unfortunate Gug could emerge from the cave and rise to his full 20 feet, the vindictive ghasts were upon him. Carter feared for a moment that he would give an alarm and arouse all his kin, till a ghoul softly gibbered that Gugs have no voice, but talk by means of facial expression. The battle which then ensued was truly a frightful one. From all sides the venomous ghasts rushed feverishly at the creeping Gug, nipping and tearing with their muzzles, and mauling murderously with their hard, pointed hooves. All the time they coughed excitedly, screaming when the great vertical mouth of the Gug would occasionally bite into one of their number, so that the noise of the combat would surely have aroused the sleeping city, had not the weakening of the sentry begun to transfer the action farther and farther within the cavern. As it was, the tumult soon receded altogether from sight in the blackness, with only occasional evil echoes to mark its continuance. Then, the most alert of the ghouls gave the signal for all to advance, and Carter followed the loping three out of the forest of monoliths and into the dark, noisome streets of that awful city, whose rounded towers of cyclopean stone soared up beyond the sight. Silently, they shambled over that rough rock pavement, hearing with disgust the abominable muffled snortings from great black doorways which marked the slumber of the Gogs. Apprehensive of the ending of the rest hour, the ghouls set a somewhat rapid pace, but even so the journey was no brief one, for distances in that town of giants are on a great scale. At last, however, they came to a somewhat open space before a tower even vaster than the rest, above whose colossal doorway was fixed a monstrous symbol in bas relief, which made one shudder without knowing its meaning. This was the central tower with the sign of Koth, and those huge stone steps just visible through the dusk within were the beginning of the great flight leading to Upper Dreamland and the Enchanted Wood. There now began a climb of interminable length in utter blackness, made almost impossible by the monstrous size of the steps, which were fashioned for Gugs, and were therefore nearly a yard high. Of their number, Carter could form no just estimate, for soon he became so worn out that the tireless and elastic ghouls were forced to aid him. All through the endless climb there lurked the peril of detection and pursuit, for though no Gug dares lift the stone door to the forest because of the Great One's curse, there are no such restraints in concerning that tower and the steps, and escaped guests are often chased even to the very top. So sharp are the ears of the Gugs that the bare feet and hands of the climbers might readily be heard when the city awoke, and it would of course take but little time for the striding giants, accustomed from their ghast hunts in the vaults of Zen to seeing without light, to overtake their smaller and slower quarry on those cyclopean steps. It was very depressing to reflect that the silent pursuing Gugs would not be heard at all, but would come very suddenly and shockingly in the dark upon the climbers. Nor could the traditional fear of Gugs for ghouls be depended upon in that peculiar place where the advantages lay so heavily with the Gugs. There was also some peril from the furtive and venomous ghasts, which frequently hopped up onto the tower during the sleep hour of the Gugs. If the Gugs slept long, and the ghasts returned soon from their deed in the cavern, the scent of the climbers might easily be picked up by those loathsome and ill-disposed things, in which case it would almost be better to be eaten by a Gug. Then, after aeons of climbing, there came a cough from the darkness above, and matters assumed a very grave and unexpected turn. It was clear that a ghast, or perhaps even more, had strayed into that tower before the coming of Carter and his guides, and it was equally clear that this peril was very close. After a breathless second, the leading ghoul pushed Carter to the wall and arranged his kinfolk in the best possible way, with the old slate tombstone raised for a crushing blow whenever the enemy might come in sight. Ghouls can see in the dark, so the party was not as badly off as if Carter would have been alone. In another moment, the clatter of hooves revealed the downward hopping of at least one beast, and the slab-bearing ghouls poised their weapon for a desperate blow. Presently 2 yellowish-red eyes flashed into view, and the panting of the ghast became audible above its clattering. As it hopped down to the step above the ghouls, they wielded the ancient gravestone with prodigious force, so that there was only a wheeze and a choking before the victim collapsed in a noxious heap. There seemed to be only this one animal, and after a moment of listening, the ghouls tapped Carter as a signal to proceed again. As before, they were obliged to aid him, and he was glad to leave that place of carnage where the ghast's uncouth remains sprawled invisible in the blackness. At last the ghouls brought their companion to a halt, and feeling above him, Carter realized that the great stone trap door was reached at last. To open so vast a thing completely was not to be thought of, but the ghouls hoped to get it up just enough to slip the gravestone under as a prop, and permit Carter to escape through the crack. They themselves planned to descend again and return through the city of the Gugs, since their elusiveness was great, and they did not know the way over land to spectral Sarkomond, with its lion-guarded gate to the abyss. Mighty was the straining of those three ghouls at the stone of the door above them, and Carter helped push with as much strength as he had. They judged the edge next to the top of the staircase to be the right one, and to this they bent all the force of their disreputably nourished muscles. After a few moments, a crack of light appeared, and Carter, to whom the task had been entrusted, slipped the end of the old gravestone into the aperture. There now ensued a mighty heaving, but progress was very slow, and they had of course to return to their first position every time they failed to turn the slab and prop the portal open. Suddenly, their desperation was magnified 1,000-fold by a sound on the steps below them. It was only the thumping and rattling of the slain guest's hooved body as it rolled down to lower levels. But of all the possible causes of that body's dislodgment and rolling, none was in the least reassuring. Therefore, knowing the ways of the gongs, the ghouls set to with something of a frenzy, and in a surprisingly short time had the doors so high that they were able to hold it still whilst Carter turned the slab and left a generous opening. They now helped Carter through, letting him climb up to their rubbery shoulders, and later guiding his feet as he clutched at the blessed soil of the upper dreamland outside. Another second, and they were through themselves, knocking away the gravestone and closing the great trap door, while a panting became audible beneath. Because of the Great One's curse, no Gug might ever emerge from that portal, so with a deep relief and a sense of repose, Carter lay quietly on the thick, grotesque fungi of the enchanted wood, while his guide squatted near in the manner that ghouls rest. Weird as was that enchanted wood through which he fared so long ago, it was verily a haven and a delight after those gulfs he had now left behind. There was no living denizen about, for Zug shunned the mysterious door in fear, and Carter at once consulted with his ghouls about their future course. To return through the tower they no longer dared, and the waking world did not appeal to them when they learned that they must pass the priests Nasht and Kamanta in the Cavern of Flame. So at length they decided to return through Sarkamand and its Gate of the Abyss, though of how to get there they knew nothing. Carter recalled that it lies in the valley below Leng, and recalled likewise that he had seen in Dylath-Leen a sinister, slant-eyed old merchant reputed to trade on Leng. Therefore he advised the ghouls to seek out Dylath-Leen, crossing the fields to Nur and the sky, and following the river to its mouth. This they at once resolved to do, and lost no time in loping off, since the thickening of the dusk promised a full night ahead for travel. And Carter shook the paws of those repulsive beasts, thanking them for their help, and sending his gratitude to the beast which was once Pikmin, but could not help sighing with pleasure when they left. For a ghoul is a ghoul, and at best an unpleasant companion for man. After that, Carter sought a forest pool and cleansed himself of the mud of nether earth, thereupon reassuming the clothes he had so carefully carried. It was now night in that redoubtable wood of monstrous trees, but because of the phosphorescence one might travel as well as by day, wherefore Carter set upon the well-known route towards Selafay, in Nuth-Nargai, beyond the Tanarian hills. And as he went, he thought of the zebra he had left tethered to an ash tree on Ingranek in far-away Uriab so many aeons ago, and wondered if any lava-gatherers had fed and released it. And he wondered, too, if he would ever return to Baharna and pay for the zebra that was slain by night in those ancient ruins by Yath's shore, and if the old tavern-keeper would remember him. Such were the thoughts that came to him in the air of the regained upper dreamland. But presently his progress was halted by a sound from a very large hollow tree. He had avoided the great circle of stones, since he did not care to speak with Zoogs just now, but it appeared from the singular fluttering in that huge tree that important councils were in session elsewhere. Upon drawing nearer, he made out the accents of a tense and heated discussion, and before long became conscious of matters which he viewed with the greatest concern. For a war on the cats was under debate in that sovereign assembly of Zoogs. It all came from the loss of the party which had sneaked after Carter to Ultar, and which the cats had justly punished for unsuitable intentions. The matter had long rankled, and now, or at least within a month, The marshaled Zoogs were about to strike the whole feline tribe in a series of surprise attacks, taking individual cats or groups of cats unawares, and giving not even the myriad cats of Ulthar a proper chance to drill and mobilize. This was the plan of the Zoogs, and Carter saw that he must foil it before leaving upon his mighty quest. Very quietly, therefore, did Randolph Carter steal to the edge of the wood, and send the cry of the cat over the starlit fields. And a great grimalkin in a nearby cottage took up the burden and relayed it across leagues of rolling meadow to warriors large and small, black, gray, tiger, white, yellow, and mixed, and it echoed through Nur, and beyond the sky, even into Ultar, and Ultar's numerous cats called into chorus and fell into a line of march. It was fortunate that the moon was not up, so that all the cats were on earth. Swiftly and silently leaping, they sprang from every hearth and housetop and poured in a great furry sea across the plains to the edge of the wood. Carter was there to greet them, and the sight of the shapely, wholesome cats was indeed good for his eyes after the things he had seen and walked with in the abyss. He was glad to see his venerable friend and one-time rescuer at the head of Ulthar's detachment, a collar of rank around his sleek neck, and whiskers bristling at a martial angle. Better still, as a sub-lieutenant in that army was a brisk young fellow who proved to be none other than the very little kitten at the inn to whom Carter had given a saucer of rich cream on that long-vanished morning in Ultar. He was a strapping and promising cat now, and he purred as he shook hands with his friend. His grandfather said he was doing very well in the army, and that he might well expect a captaincy after one more campaign. Carter now outlined the peril of the cat tribe, and was rewarded by deep-throated purrs of gratitude from all sides. Consulting with the generals, he prepared a plan of instant action which involved marching at once upon the Zoog Council and other known strongholds of the Zoogs, forestalling their surprise attacks and forcing them to terms before the mobilization of their army of invasion. Thereupon, without a moment's loss, that great ocean of cats flooded the enchanted wood and surged around the council tree and the great stone circle. Flutterings rose to panic pitch as the enemy saw the newcomers, and there was very little resistance among the furtive and curious brown Zoogs. They saw that they were beaten in advance, and turned from thoughts of vengeance to thoughts of present self-preservation. Half the cats now seated themselves in a circular formation with the captured Zoogs in the center, leaving open a lane down which were marched the additional captives rounded up by the other cats in other parts of the wood. Terms were discussed at length, Carter acting as interpreter, and it was decided that the Zoogs might remain a free tribe on condition of rendering to the cats a large tribute of grouse, quail, and pheasants from the less fabulous parts of the forest. 12 young Zoogs of noble families were taken as hostages to be kept in the Temple of Cats at Ultar, and the victors made it plain that any disappearances of cats on the borders of the Zoog domain would be followed by consequences highly disastrous to Zoogs. These matters disposed of, the assembled cats broke ranks and permitted the Zoogs to slink off, one by one, to their respective homes, which they hastened to do with many a sullen backward glance. The old cat general now offered Carter an escort through the forest to whatever border he wished to reach, deeming it likely that the Zoogs would harbor dire resentment against him for the frustration of their warlike enterprise. This offer he welcomed with gratitude, not only for the safety it afforded, but because he liked the graceful companionship of cats. So, in the midst of a pleasant and playful regiment, relaxed after the successful performance of its duty, Randolph Carter walked with dignity through that enchanted and phosphorescent wood of Titan trees, talking of his quest with the old general and his grandson, whilst others of the band indulged in fantastic gambols or chased fallen leaves that the wind drove among the fungi of that primeval floor. And the old cat said that he had heard much of unknown Kadath in the cold waste, but did not know where it was. As for the marvelous sunset city, he had not even heard of that, but would gladly relay to Carter anything he might later learn. He gave the seekers some passwords of great value among the cats of Dreamland, and commended him especially to the old chief of the cats in Celiphae, whither he was bound. That old cat, already slightly known to Carter, was a dignified Maltese, and would prove highly influential in any transaction. It was dawn when they came to the proper edge of the wood, and Carter bade his friends a reluctant farewell. The young sub-lieutenant he had met as a small kitten would have followed him had not the old general forbidden it, but that austere patriarch insisted that the path of duty lay with the tribe and the army. So Carter set out alone over the golden fields that stretched mysterious beside a willow-fringed river, and the cats went back into the wood. Well did the traveler know those garden lands that lie betwixt the woods of the Serenarian Sea, and blithely did he follow the singing river Okeanos that marked his course. The sun rose higher over gentle slopes of grove and lawn, and heightened the colors of the thousand flowers that starred on each knoll and dangle. A blessed haze lies upon all this region, wherein is held a little more of the sunlight than other places hold, and a little more of the summer's humming music of birds and bees, so that men walk through it as through a fairy place, and feel greater joy and wonder than they ever afterward remember. By noon Carter reached the jasper terraces of Kirin, which slope down to the river's edge, and bear that temple of loveliness wherein the king of Ilik-Vad comes from his far realm on the twilight sea once a year in a golden palanquin to pray to the god of Okeanos, who sang to him in youth when he dwelt in a cottage by its banks. All of Jasper is that temple, and covering an acre of ground with its walls and courts, its 7 pinnacled towers, and its inner shrine where the river enters through hidden channels, and the god sings softly in the night. Many times the moon hears strange music as it shines on those courts and terraces and pinnacles. But whether that music be the song of the god, or the chant of the cryptical priests, none but the king of Ilik-Vad may say, for only he had entered the temple or seen the priests. Now, in the drowsiness of day, that carven and delicate fane was silent. Carter heard only the murmur of the great stream, and the hum of the birds and bees, as he walked onward under the enchanted sun. All that afternoon, the pilgrim wandered on through perfumed meadows, and in the lee of gentle riverward hills bearing peaceful thatched cottages, and the shrines of amiable gods carven from jasper or chrysoberyl. Sometimes he walked close to the bank of Okeanos, and whistled to the sprightly and iridescent fish of that crystal stream, and at other times he paused amidst the whispering rushes, and gazed at the great dark wood on the farther side, whose trees came down clear to the water's edge. In former dreams he had seen quaint lumbering bupons come shyly out of that wood to drink, but now he could not glimpse any. Once in a while he paused to watch a carnivorous fish catching a fishing bird, which it lured to the water by showing its tempting scales in the sun, and grasped by the beak with its enormous mouth, as the winged hunters sought to dart down upon it. Toward evening he mounted a low grassy rise, and saw before him flaming in the sunset the 1,000 gilded spires of Thrawn. Lofty beyond belief are the alabaster walls of that incredible city, sloping inward toward the top, and wrought in one solid piece by what means no man knows, for they are more ancient than memory. Yet lofty as they are within their 100 gates and 200 turrets, the clustered towers within, all white beneath their golden spires, are loftier still, so that men on the plain around see them soaring into the sky, sometimes shining clear, sometimes caught at the top in tangles of cloud and mist, and sometimes clouded lower down with their utmost pinnacles blazing free above the vapors. And where Thrawn's gates open on the river are great wharves of marble, with ornate galleons of fragrant cedar and calamander riding gently at anchor, and strange bearded sailors sitting on casks and bales, with the hieroglyphs of far places. Landward beyond the walls lies the farm country, where small white cottages stream between little hills, and narrow roads with many stone bridges wind gracefully among streams and gardens. Down through this verdant land Carter walked at evening, and saw twilight float up from the river to the marvelous golden spires of Thrawn. And just at the hour of dusk he came to the southern gate, and was stopped by a red-robed sentry till he had told 3 dreams beyond belief, that proved himself a dreamer worthy to walk up Thrawn's steep, mysterious streets, and linger in the bazaars, where the wares of the ornate galleons were sold. Then into that incredible city he walked, through a wall so thick that the gate was a tunnel, and thereafter amidst curved and undulated ways winding deep and narrow between the heavenward towers. Light shone through grated and balconied windows, and the sound of lutes and pipes stole timid from inner courts where marble fountains bubbled. Carter knew his way, and edged down through darker streets to the river, where at an old sea tavern he found the captains and seamen he had known in myriad other dreams. There he bought his passage to Celophae on a great green galleon, and there he stopped for the night after speaking gravely to the venerable cats of the inn, who blinked dozingly before an enormous hearth, and dreamed of old wars and forgotten gods. In the morning, Carter boarded the galleon bound for Celophae, and sat in the prow as the ropes were cast off, and the long sail down to the Serenarian Sea begun. For many leagues the banks were much as they were above Thran, with now and then a curious temple rising on the farther hills toward the right, and a drowsy village on the shore, with steep red roofs and nets spread in the sun. Mindful of his search, Carter questioned all the mariners closely about those whom they had met in the taverns of Celophae, asking the names and ways of the strange men with long, narrow eyes, long-lobed ears, thin noses, and pointed chins, who came in dark ships from the north, and traded onyx for the carved jade and spun gold and little red singing birds of Celophae. Of these men, the sailors knew not much, save that they talked but seldom, and spread a kind of awe about them. Their land, very far away, was called Inquinoc, and not many people cared to go thither, because it was a cold twilight land, and said to be close to unpleasant Leng, although high impassable mountains towered on the side where Leng was thought to lie, so that none might say whether this evil plateau, with its horrible stone villages and unmentionable monastery, were really there, or whether the rumor were only a fear that timid people felt in the night, when those formidable barrier peaks loomed black against a rising moon. Certainly, men reached Leng from very different oceans. Of other boundaries of Inquinoc, those sailors had no notion, nor had they heard of the cold waste and unknown Kadath, save from vague, unplaced report. And of the marvelous sunset city which Carter sought, they knew nothing at all. So the traveler asked no more of far things, but bided his time till he might talk with those strange men from cold and twilight Inquinoc, who are the seed of such gods as carve their features on Ingranek. Late in the day, the galleon reached those bends of the river which traverse the perfumed jungles of Kiad. Here Carter wished he might disembark, for in those tropic tangles sleep wondrous places of ivory, lone and unbroken, where once dwelt fabulous monarchs of a land whose name is forgotten. Spells of the Elder Ones keep those places unharmed and undecayed, for it is written that there may one day be need of them again, and elephant caravans have glimpsed them from afar by moonlight, though none dares approach them closely, because of the guardians to which their wholeness is due. But the ship swept on, and dusk hushed the hum of the day, and the first stars above blinked answers to the early fireflies on the banks, as that jungle fell far behind, leaving only its fragrance as a memory that it had been. And all through the night that galleon floated on, past mysteries unseen and unsuspected. Once a lookout reported fires on the hills to the east, but the sleepy captain said they had better not be looked at too much, since it was highly uncertain just who, or what, had lit them. In the morning, the river had broadened out greatly, and Carter saw by the houses along the banks that they were close to the vast trading city of Halanith on the Serenarian Sea. Here, the walls are of rugged granite, and the houses peaked fantastic with beamed and plastered gables. The men of Halanith are more like those of the waking world than any others in Dreamland, so that the city is not sought except for barter, but is prized for the solid work of its artisans. The wharves of Halanith are of oak, and there the galleon made fast, while the captain traded in the taverns. Carter also went ashore, and looked curiously upon the rutted streets, where wooden ox carts lumbered and feverish merchants cried their wares vacuously in the bazaars. The sea taverns were all close to the wharves, on cobbled lanes salted with the spray of high tides, and seemed exceedingly ancient with their low black-beamed ceilings and casements of greenish bull's-eye panes. Ancient sailors in those taverns talked much of distant ports, and told many stories of the curious men from twilight Inquinac, but had little to add to what the seamen of the galleon had told. Then at last, after much unloading and loading, the ship set sail once more over the sunset sea, and the high walls and gables of Halanith grew less as the last golden lights of day lent them a wonder and beauty beyond any that men had given them. 2 nights and 2 days the galleon sailed over the Serenarian Sea, sighting no land and speaking but one other vessel. Then near sunset of the second day, there loomed up ahead the snowy peak of Iran, with its ginkgo trees swaying on the lower slope, and Carter knew that they were come to the land of Uthnar-Gai and the marvelous city of Selefeh. Swiftly there came into sight the glittering minarets of that fabulous town, and the untarnished marble walls with their bronze statues, and the great stone bridge where Naraksa joins the sea. Then rose the gentle hills behind the town, with their groves and gardens of asphodels, and the small shrines and cottages upon them, and far in the background the purple ridge of the Tanarians, potent and mystical, behind which lay forbidden ways into the waking world and toward other regions of dream. The harbor was full of painted galleys, some of which were from the marble-clouded city of Cernanian, that lies in ethereal space beyond where the sea meets the sky, and some of which were from more substantial parts of Dreamland. Among these, the steersman threaded his way up to the spice-fragrant wharves, where the galleon made fast in the dusk, as the city's million lights began to twinkle out over the water. Ever new seemed this deathless city of vision, for here time had no power to tarnish or destroy. As it has always been, is still the turquoise of North Horthath, and the 80 orchid-wreathed priests are the same who builded it 10,000 years ago. Shining still is the bronze of the great gates, nor are the onyx pavements ever worn or broken, and the great bronze statues on the walls look down on merchants and camel drivers older than fable, yet without one gray hair in their forked beards. Carter did not once seek out the temple, or the palace, or the citadel, but stayed by the seaward wall among traders and sailors, and when it was too late for rumors and legends, he sought out an ancient tavern he knew well, and rested with dreams of the gods on unknown Kadath, whom he sought. The next day he searched all along the quays for some of the strange mariners of Inquinac, but was told that none were now in port, their galley not being due from the north for full 2 weeks. He found, however, one Thorabonian sailor, who had been to Inquinac, and had worked in the onyx quarries of that twilight place, and this sailor said there was certainly a descent to the north of the peopled region, which everybody seemed to fear and shun. The Thorabonian opined that the desert led around the utmost rim of impassable peaks into Leng's horrible plateau, and that this is why men feared it, though he admitted there were other vague tales of evil presences and nameless sentinels. Whether or not this could be the fabled waste where an unknown Kadath stands, he did not know, but it seemed unlikely that those presences and sentinels, if indeed they existed, were stationed for naught. On the following day, Carter walked up the Street of the Pillars to the Turquoise Temple and talked with the High Priest. Though Nath-Hortath is chiefly worshipped in Seliphe, all the great ones are mentioned in diurnal prayers, and the priest was reasonably versed in their moods. Like a tall and distant Ultar, he strongly advised against any attempts to see them, declaring that they are testy and capricious, and subject to strange protection from the mindless other gods from outside, whose soul and messenger is the crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep. Their jealous hidings of the marvelous Sunset City shewed clearly that they did not wish Carter to reach it, and it was doubtful that they would regard a guest whose object was to see them and plead before them. No man had ever found Kadath in the past, and it might be just as well if none ever found it in the future. Such rumors as were told about that onyx castle of the Great Ones were not by any means reassuring. Having thanked the orchid-crowned high priest, Carter left the temple and sought out the bazaars of the sheep butchers, where the old chief of Seliphe cats dwelt sleek and contented. That gray and dignified being was sunning himself on the onyx pavement, and extended a languid paw as his caller approached. But when Carter repeated the passwords and introductions furnished him by the old cat general of Ultar, the furry patriarch became very cordial and communicative, and told much of the secret lore known to cats on the seaward slopes of Uth-Nargai. Best of all, he repeated several things told him furtively by the timid waterfront cats of Seliphe about the men of Inquinac, on whose dark ships no cat will go. It seems that these men have an aura not of earth about them, though that is not the reason why no cat will sail on their ships. The reason for this is that Inquinac holds shadows which no cat can endure, so that in all that cold twilight realm there is never a cheering purr or a homely mew. Whether it be because of things wafted over the impassable peaks from hypothetical Lang, or because of things filtering down from the chilly desert to the north, none may say. But it remains a fact that in that far land there broods a hint of outer space which cats do not like, and to which they are more sensitive than men. Therefore they will not go on the dark ships that seek the basalt quays of Inquinac. The old chief of the cat also told him where to find his friend King Karains, who in Carter's latter dreams had reigned alternately in the rose-crystal palace of the 70 Delights at Seliphe, and in the turreted cloud castle of sky-floating Cernanian. It seemed that he could no more find content in those places, but had formed a mighty longing for the English cliffs and downlands of his boyhood, where in little dreaming villages England's old songs hover at evening behind lattice windows, and where grey church towers peep lovely through the verdure of distant valleys. He could not go back to those things in the waking world because his body was dead, but he had done the next best thing, and dreamed a small tract of such countryside in the region east of the city where the meadows roll gracefully up from the sea cliffs to the foot of the Tanarian hills. There he dwelt in a grey Gothic manor house of stone looking on the sea, and tried to think it was ancient Trevored Towers, where he was born and where 30 generations of his forefathers had first seen the light. And on the coast nearby he had built a little Cornish fishing village, and steep cobbled ways, settling therein such people as had the most English faces, and seeking ever to teach them the dear remembered accents of old Cornwall fishers. And in a valley not far off, he had reared a great Norman abbey whose tower he could see from his window, placing around it in the churchyard grey stones, with the names of his ancestors carved thereon, and with a moss somewhat like old England's moss. For though Karains was a monarch in the land of dream, with all imagined pomps and marvels, splendors and beauties, ecstasies and delights, novelties and excitements at his command, he would gladly have resigned forever the whole of his power and luxury and freedom, for one blessed day, as a simple boy, in that pure and quiet England, that ancient, beloved England, which had molded his being, and of which he must always be immutably a part. So when Carter bade that old grey chief of the cats adieu, he did not seek the terraced palace of rose crystal, but walked out the eastern gate and across the daisied fields towards a peaked gable which he glimpsed through the oaks of a park sloping up to the sea cliffs. And in time he came to a great hedge and a gate with a little brick lodge, and when he rang the bell, there hobbled to admit him no robed and anointed lackey of the palace, but a small, stubby old man in a smock, who spoke as best he could in the quaint tones of far Cornwall. And Carter walked up the shady path between trees, as near as possible to England's trees, and clumbed the terraces among gardens set out in Queen Anne's time. At the door, flanked by stone cats in the old way, he was met by a whiskered butler in suitable livery, and was presently taken to the library where Karains, Lord of Uth-Nargai in the sky round Sereninian, sat pensive in a chair by the window, looking on his little sea-coast village, and wishing that his old nurse would come in and scold him, because he was not ready for that hateful lawn party at the vicar's, with the carriage waiting, and his mother nearly out of patience. Karains, clad in a dressing gown of the sort favoured by London tailors in his youth, rose eagerly to meet his guest, for the sight of an Anglo-Saxon from the waking world was very dear to him, even if it was a Saxon from Boston, Massachusetts, instead of from Cornwall. And for long they talked of old times, having much to say because both were old dreamers and well versed in the wonders of incredible places. Karains, indeed, had been out beyond the stars in the ultimate void, and was said to be the only one who had ever returned sane from such a voyage. At length Carter brought up the subject of his quest, and asked of his host those questions he had asked of so many others. Karains did not know where Kadath was, or the marvelous Sunset City, but he did know that the great old ones were very dangerous creatures to seek out, and that the other gods had strange ways of protecting them from impertinent curiosity. He had learned much of the other gods in distant parts of space, especially in that region where form does not exist, and colored gases study the innermost secrets. The violet gas Sungak had told him terrible things of the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep, and had warned him never to approach the central void where the daemon Sultan Azathoth gnaws hungrily in the dark. Altogether, it was not well to meddle with the Elder Ones, and if they persistently denied all access to the marvelous Sunset City, it were better not to seek that city. Karains furthermore doubted whether his guest would profit aught by coming to the city, even were he to gain it. He himself had dreamed and yearned long years for lovely Seliphae and the land of Uth-Nargai, and for the freedom and color and high experience of life devoid of its chains and conventions and stupidities. But now that he was come into that city and that land, and was the king thereof, he found the freedom and the vividness all too soon worn out, and monotonous for want of linkage with anything firm in his feelings and memories. He was a king in Uth-Nargai, but found no meaning therein, and drooped always for the old familiar things of England that shaped his youth. All his kingdom he would give for the sound of Cornish church bells over the downs, and the thousand minarets of Seliphae, for the steep, homely roofs of the villages near his home. So he told his guest that the unknown Sunset City might not hold quite the content he sought, and that perhaps it had better remain a glorious and half-remembered dream. For he had visited Carter often in the old waking days, and knew well the lovely New England slopes that had given him birth. At last, he was very certain the seeker would long only for the early remembered scenes, the glow of Beacon Hill at evening, the tall steeples and winding hill streets of quaint Kingsport, the hoary gambrel roofs of ancient and witch-haunted Arkham, and the blessed meads and valleys where stone walls rambled and white farmhouse gables peeped out from bowers of verdure. These things he told Randolph Carter, but still the seeker held to his purpose, and in the end they parted each with his own conviction, and Carter went back through the bronze gate into Celiphae, and down the street of pillars to the old sea-wall, where he talked more with the mariners of far ports, and waited for the dark ship from cold and twilight Inquinoc, whose strange-faced sailors and onyx traders had in them the blood of the Great Ones. One starlit evening, when the Pharos shone splendid over the harbor, the longed-for ship put in, and strange-faced sailors and traders appeared one by one and group by group in the ancient taverns along the sea-wall. It was very exciting to see those living faces, so like the godlike features of Ingranec, but Carter did not hasten to speak with the silent seaman. He did not know much of pride and secrecy, and dim supernal memory might fill those children of the Great Ones, and was sure it would not be wise to tell them of his quest, or ask too closely of that cold desert stretching north of their twilight land. They talked little with the other folk in those ancient sea taverns, but would gather in groups in remote corners, and sing among themselves the haunting airs of unknown places, or chant long tales to one another in accents alien to the rest of Dreamland. And so rare and moving were those airs and tales that one might guess their wonders from the faces of those who listened, even though the words came to common ears only as strange cadence, an obscure melody. For a week, the strange seamen lingered in the taverns and traded in the bazaars of Celiphae. Before they sailed, Carter had taken passage on their dark ship, telling them that he was an old onyx miner, and wishful to work in their quarries. That ship was very lovely, and cunningly wrought, being of teak wood, with ebony fittings and traceries of gold, and the cabin in which the traveler lodged had hangings of silk and velvet. One morning, at the turn of the tide, the sails were raised and the anchor lifted, and as Carter stood on the high stern, he saw the sunrise blazing walls and bronze statues and golden minarets of ageless Celiphae sink into the distance, and the snowy peak of Mount Man grow smaller and smaller. By noon there was nothing in sight save the gentle blue of the Serenarian Sea, with one painted galley afar off bound for that realm of Serenadian, where the sea meets the sky. And the night came with gorgeous stars, and the dark ship steered for Charles Wain and the Little Bear as they swung slowly round the pole, and the sailors sang strange songs of unknown places, and they stole off one by one to the forecastle, while the wistful watchers murmured old chants and leaned over the rail to glimpse the luminous fish playing in bowers beneath the sea. Carter went to sleep at midnight, and rose in the glow of a young morning, marking that the sun seemed farther south than was its wont. And all through that second day he made progress in knowing the men of the ship, getting them little by little to talk of their cold twilight land, of their exquisite onyx city, and of their fear of the high and impassable peaks beyond which Ling was said to be. They told him how sorry they were that no cats would stain the land of Inquinoc, and how they thought the hidden nearness of Lang was to blame for it. Only of the stony desert to the north they would not talk. There was something disquieting about that desert, and it was thought expedient not to admit its existence. On later days, they talked of the quarries in which Carter said he was going to work. There were many of them, for the city of Inquinoc was builded of onyx, whilst great polished blocks of it were traded in Renar, Ograthon, and Celiphae, and at home with the merchants of Thra, Flarnec, and Kadatheron, were the beautiful wares of those fabulous ports. And far to the north, almost in the cold desert whose existence the men of Inquinoc did not care to admit, there was an unused quarry greater than all the rest, from which had been hewn in forgotten times such prodigious lumps and blocks that the sight of their chiseled vacancies struck terror to all who beheld. Who had mined those incredible blocks, and whither they had been transported, no man might say, but it was thought best not to trouble that quarry, around which such inhuman memories might conceivably cling. So it was left all alone in the twilight, with only the raven and the rumored shantak bird to brood on its immensities. When Carter heard of this quarry, he was moved to deep thought, for he knew from old tales that the Great One's castle atop unknown Kadath is of onyx. Each day the sun wheeled lower and lower in the sky, and the mists overhead grew thicker and thicker, and in 2 weeks there was not any sunlight at all, but only a weird gray twilight shining through a dome of eternal cloud by day, and a cold, starless phosphorescence from the underside of that cloud by night. On the 20th day, a great jagged rock in the sea was sighted from afar, the first land glimpse since man's snowy peak had dwindled behind the ship. Carter asked the captain the name of that rock, but was told it had no name. It had never been sought by any vessel because of the sounds that came from it at night. And when, after dark, a dull and ceaseless howling arose from that jagged granite place, the traveler was glad that no stop had been made, and that the rock had no name. The seaman prayed and chanted till the noise was out of earshot, and Carter dreamed terrible dreams within dreams in the small hours. 2 mornings after that, there loomed far ahead and to the east a line of great gray peaks, whose tops were lost in the changeless clouds of that twilight world. And at the sight of them, the sailors sang glad songs, and some knelt down on the decks to pray, so that Carter knew that they were come close to the land of Inquinag, and would soon be moored to the basalt quays of the great town bearing the land's name. Toward noon, a dark coastline appeared, and before 3 o'clock there stood out against the north the bulbous domes and fantastic spires of the onyx city. Rare and curious did that archaic city rise above its walls and quays, all of delicate blacks with scrolls, flutings, and arabesques of inlaid gold. Tall and many-windowed were its houses, and carved on every side with flowers and patterns, whose dark symmetries dazzled the eye with a beauty more poignant than light. Some ended in swelling domes that tapered to a point, others in terraced pyramids whereon rose clustered minarets displaying every phase of strangeness and imagination. The walls were low and pierced by frequent gates, each under a great arch rising high above the general level, and capped by the head of a god chiseled with that same skill displayed in the monstrous face on distant Ingranek. On a hill in the center rose a 16-angled tower, greater than all the rest, and bearing a high pinnacled belfry resting on a flattened dome. This, the seaman said, was the temple of the Elder Ones, and was ruled by an old high priest, sad with inner secrets. At intervals, the clang of a strange bell shivered over the onyx city, answered each time by a peal of mystic music made up of horns, viols, and chanting voices. And from a row of tripods on a galley round the high dome of the temple there burst flares of flame at certain moments, for the priests and people of that city were wise in the primal mysteries, and faithful in keeping the rhythms of the great old ones, as set forth in scrolls older than the Narcotic manuscript. As the ship rode past the great basalt breakwater into the harbor, the lesser noises of the city grew manifest, and Carter saw the slaves, sailors, and merchants on the docks. The sailors and merchants were the strange-faced race of the gods, but the slaves were squat, slant-eyed folk, said by rumor to have drifted somehow across, or around, the impassable peaks from the valleys beyond Lang. The wharves reached wide outside the city wall, and bore upon them all manner of merchandise from the galleys anchored there, while at one end were great piles of onyx both carved and uncarved, awaiting shipment to the far markets of Renar, Augrathon, and Celophae. It was not yet evening when the dark ship anchored beside a jutting quay of stone, and all the sailors and traders filed ashore, and through the arched gates into the city. The streets of that city were paved with onyx, and some of them were wide and straight, while others were crooked and narrow. The houses near the water were lower than the rest, and bore above their curiously arched doorways certain signs of gold, said to be in honor of the respective small gods that favored each. The captain of the ship took Carter to an old seed tavern, where flocked the mariners of quaint countries, and promised that he would next day shew him the wonders of the twilight city, and lead him to the taverns of the onyx miners by the northern wall. And evening fell, and little bronze lamps were lighted, and the sailors in that tavern sang songs of remote places. But when from its high tower the great bell shivered over the city, and the peals of the horns and viols and voices rose cryptical in answer thereto, all ceased their songs or tales, and bowed silent, till the last echo died away. For there is a wonder and a strangeness on the twilight city of Inquinac, and men fear to be lax in its rites, lest a doom and a vengeance lurk unsuspectedly close. Far in the shadows of that tavern, Carter saw a squat form he did not like, for it was unmistakably that of the old slant-eyed merchant he had seen so long before in the tavern of Dylath-Leen, who was reputed to trade with the horrible stone villages of Leng, which no healthy folk visit, and whose evil fires are seen at night from afar, and even to have dealt with that high priest not to be described, which wears a yellow silken mask over its face, and dwells all alone in a prehistoric stone monastery. This man had seemed to shew a queer gleam of knowing when Carter asked the traders of Dylath-Leen about the cold waste and Kadath, and somehow his presence in dark and haunted Inquinac, so close to the wonders of the north, was not a reassuring thing. He slipped wholly out of sight before Carter could speak to him, and sailors later said that he had come with a yak caravan from some point not well determined, bearing the colossal and rich-flavored eggs of the rumored shantak bird to trade for the dexterous jade goblets that merchants brought. On the following morning, the ship captain led Carter through the onyx streets of Inquinac, dark under their twilight sky. The inlaid doors and figured-housed fronts, carven balconies, and crystal-paned oriels all gleamed with a somber and polished loveliness. And now and then a plaza would open out with black pillars, colonnades, and the statues of curious beings both human and fabulous. Some of the vistas down long and unbending streets, or through side alleys and over bulbous domes, spires, and arabesqued roofs, were weird and beautiful beyond words, and nothing was more splendid than the massive heights of the great central Temple of the Elder Ones, with its 16 carven sides, its flattened dome, and its lofty pinnacled belfry overtopping all else, and majestic, whatever its foreground. And always to the east, far beyond the city walls and the leagues of pasture land, rose the gaunt gray sides of those topless and impassable peaks, across which hideous Leng was said to lie. The captain took Carter to the mighty temple, which is set with its walled garden in a great round plaza, whence the streets go as spokes from a wheel's hub. The 7 arched gates of that garden, each having over it a carven face like those of the city's gates, are always open, and the people roam reverently at will down the tiled paths, and through the little lanes lined with grotesque termini and the shrines of modest gods. And there are fountains, pools, and basins there to reflect the frequent blaze of the tripods on the high balcony, all of onyx, and having in them small luminous fish taken by divers from the lower bowers of ocean. When the deep clang from the temple belfry shivers over the garden and the city, and the answer of the horns and viols and voices peals out from the 7 lodges by the garden gates, there issue from the 7 doors of the temple long columns of masked and hooded priests in black, bearing at arm's length before them the great golden bowls from which a curious steam rises. And all the 7 columns strut peculiarly in a single file, legs thrown far forward without bending the knees, down the walks that lead to the 7 lodges, wherein they disappear and do not appear again. It is said that subterranean paths connect the lodges with the temple, and that the long files of priests return through them, nor is it unwhispered that deep flights of onyx stairs go down to mysteries that are never told. But only a few are those who hint that the priests in the masked and hooded columns are not human beings. Carter did not enter the temple, because none but the veiled king is permitted to do that. But before he left the garden, the hour of the bell came, and he heard the shivering clang deafening above him, and the wailing of the horns and the viols, and the voices loud from the lodges by the gates. And down the 7 great walks stalked the long files of bowl-bearing priests in their singular way, giving to the traveler a fear from which human priests do not often give. When the last of them had vanished, he had left that garden, noting as he did so a spot on the pavement over which the bulls had passed. Even the ship captain did not like that spot, and hurried him on toward the hill whereon the veiled king's palace rises, many-domed and marvelous. Carter and his guide climbed up an alley that was all steps between inlaid walls bearing strange signs in gold, and under balconies and oriels whence sometimes floated soft strains of music, or breaths of exotic fragrance. Always ahead loomed those Titan walls, mighty buttresses, and clustered and bulbous domes, for which the veiled king's palace is famous, and at length they passed under a great black arch and emerged in the gardens of the monarch's pleasure. There Carter paused in faintness at so much beauty, with the onyx terraces and colonnaded walls, the gay portieres, and delicate flowering trees, espaliered to golden lattices and brazen urns, and tripods with cunning bas-reliefs, the pedestaled and almost breathing statues of veined black marble, the basalt-bottomed lagoons tiled fountains with luminous fish, the tiny temples of iridescent singing birds atop carven columns, the marvelous scroll-work of the great bronze gates, and the blossoming vines trained along every inch of the polished walls, all joined to form a sight whose loveliness was beyond reality, and half fabulous, even in the land of dreams. No other human presence was there, and Carter was glad it was so. Then they turned and descended again the onyx alley of steps, for the palace itself no visitor may enter, and it is not well to look too long and steadily at the great central dome, since it is said to house the archaic father of all the rumored Shantak birds, and to send out queer dreams to the curious. After that, the captain took Carter to the north quarter of the town, near the gate of the caravans, where are the taverns of the yak merchants and the onyx miners. And there, in a low-ceiled inn of quarrymen, they said farewell, for business called the captain whilst Carter was eager to talk with the miners about the north. There were many men in that inn, and the traveler was not long in speaking to some of them, saying that he was an old miner of onyx, and anxious to know of Inquinox quarries. But all that he had learned was not much more than he knew before, for the miners were timid and evasive about the cold desert to the north, and the quarry that no man visits. They had fears of fabled emissaries from around the mountains where Leng is said to lie, and of evil presences and nameless sentinels far north among the scattered rocks. And they whispered also that the rumored Shantak birds are no wholesome things, it being, indeed, for the best that no man has ever truly seen one, for that fabled father of Shantaks in the king's dome is fed in the dark. The next day, saying that he wished to look over all the various mines for himself and to visit the scattered farms and quaint onyx villages of Inquinox, Carter hired a yak and stuffed great leathern saddlebags for a journey. Beyond the gate of the caravans, the road lay straight betwixt tilled fields, with many odd farmhouses crowned by low domes. At some of these houses the seeker stopped to ask questions, once finding a host so austere and reticent, and so full of an unplaced majesty like to that in the huge features on Ingranek, that he felt certain he had come at last upon one of the great ones themselves, or upon one with full 9/10 of their blood, dwelling amongst men. And to that austere and reticent Carter, he was careful to speak very well of the gods, and to praise all the blessings they had ever accorded him. That night Carter camped in a roadside meadow beneath a great ligath tree, to which he tied his yak, and in the morning resumed his northward pilgrimage. At about 10 o'clock, he reached the small domed village of Urg, where traders rest and miners tell their tales, and paused in its taverns till noon. It is here that the great caravan road turns west towards Salarn, but Carter kept on north by the quarry road. All the afternoon he followed that rising road, which was somewhat narrower than the great highway, and which now led through a region with more rocks than tilled fields. And by evening the low hills on his left had risen into sizable black cliffs, so that he knew he was close to the mining country. All the while, the great gaunt sides of the impassable mountains towered afar off at his right, and the farther he went, the worse tales he heard of them from the scattered farmers and traders and drivers of lumbering onyx carts along the way. On the second night, he camped in the shadow of a large black crag, tethering his yak to a stake driven in the ground. He observed the great phosphorescence of the clouds at his northerly point, and more than once thought he saw dark shapes outlined against them. And on the third morning he came in sight of the first onyx quarry, and greeted the men who there labored with picks and chisels. Before evening he had passed 11 quarries, the land being here given over altogether to onyx cliffs and boulders, with no vegetation at all, but only the great rocky fragments scattered about a floor of black earth, with the gray impassable peaks always rising gaunt and sinister on his right. The third night he spent in a camp of quarrymen whose flickering fires cast weird reflections on the polished cliffs to the west. And they sang many songs and told many tales, shewing such strange knowledge of the olden days and the habits of gods that Carter could see that they held many latent memories of their sires, the great ones. They asked him whither he went, and cautioned him not to go too far to the north, but he replied that he was seeking new cliffs of onyx, and would take no more risks than were common among prospectors. In the morning he bade them adieu and rode on into the darkening north, where they had warned him he would find the feared and unvisited quarry, whence hands older than men's hands had wrenched prodigious blocks. But he did not like it when, turning back to wave a last farewell, he thought he saw approaching the camp that squat and evasive old merchant with slanting eyes, whose conjectured traffic with Lang was the gossip of distant Dylath-Leen. After 2 more quarries, the inhabited part of Inquinox seemed to end, and the road narrowed to a steeply rising yak path among forbidding black cliffs. Always on the right towered the gaunt and distant peaks, and as Carter climbed farther and farther into this untraversed realm, he found it grew darker and colder. Soon he perceived that there were no prints of feet or hooves on the black path beneath, and realized that he was indeed come into strange and deserted ways of elder time. Once in a while a raven would creak far overhead, and now and then a flapping behind some vast rock would make him think uncomfortably of the rumored shantak bird. But in the main he was alone with his shaggy steed, and it troubled him to observe that this excellent yak became more and more reluctant to advance, and more disposed to snort affrightedly at any small noise along the route. The path now contracted between sable and glistening walls, and began to display an even greater steepness than before. It was a bad footing, and the yak often slipped on the stony fragments strewn thickly about. In 2 hours, Carter saw ahead a definite crest, beyond which was nothing but dull gray sky, and blessed the prospect of a level or downward course. To reach this crest, however, was no easy task, for the way had grown nearly perpendicular, and was perilous with loose black gravel and small stones. Eventually, Carter dismounted and led his dubious yak, pulling very hard when the animal balked or stumbled, and keeping his own footing as best he might. Then, suddenly, he came to the top and saw beyond, and gasped at what he saw. The path indeed led straight ahead and slightly down, with the same lines of high natural walls as before, but on the left hand there opened out a monstrous space, vast acres of extent, where some archaic power had riven and rent the natural cliffs of onyx in the form of a giant's quarry. Far back into the solid precipice ran that cyclopean gouge, and deep down within earth's bowels its lower delvings yawned. It was no quarry of man, and the black concave sides were scarred with great squares, yards wide, which told of the size of the blocks once hewn by nameless hands and chisels. High over its jagged rim, huge ravens flapped and croaked, and vague whirrings in the unseen depths told of bats or urhags or less mentionable presences haunting the endless blackness. There, Carter stood in the narrow way amidst the twilight, with the rocky path sloping down before him, tall onyx cliffs on his right that led on as far as he could see, and tall cliffs on the left that chopped off just ahead to make that terrible and unearthly quarry. All at once the yak uttered a cry and burst from his control, leaping past him and darting on in a panic till it vanished down the narrow slope toward the north. Stones kicked by its flying hooves fell over the brink of the quarry and lost themselves in the dark, without any sound of striking the bottom. But Carter ignored the perils of that scanty path as he raced breathlessly after the flying steed. Soon the left-behind cliffs resumed their course, making the way once more narrow line, and still the traveler leaped on after the yak, whose great wide prints told of its desperate flight. Once he thought he heard the hoofbeats of the frightened beast, and doubled his speed from this encouragement. He was covering miles, and little by little the way was broadening in front, till he knew he must soon emerge on the cold and dreaded desert to the north. The gaunt gray flanks of the distant, impassable peaks were again visible above the right-handed crags, and ahead were the rocks and boulders of an open space which was clearly a foretaste of the dark, arid, limitless plain. And once more those hoofbeats sounded in his ears, plainer than before, but this time giving terror instead of encouragement, because he realized that they were not the frightened hoofbeats of his fleeing yak. The beats were ruthless and purposeful, and they were behind him. Carter's pursuit of the yak became now a flight from a thing unseen, for though he dared not glance over his shoulder, he felt that the presence behind him could be nothing wholesome or mentionable. His yak must have heard or felt it first, and he did not like to ask himself whether it had followed him from the haunts of men, or had floundered up out of that black quarry pit. Meanwhile, the cliffs had been left behind, so that the oncoming night fell over a great waste of sand and spectral rocks, wherein all paths were lost. He could not see the hoofprints of his yak, but always from behind him there came that detestable clopping, mingled now and then with what he fancied were titanic flappings and whirrings. That he was losing ground seemed unhappily clear to him, that he knew that he was hopelessly lost in this broken and blasted desert of meaningless rocks and untraveled sands. Only those remote and impassable peaks on the right gave him any sense of direction, and even they were less clear as the gray twilight waned, and the sickly phosphorescence of the clouds took its place. Then, dim and misty in the darkling north before him, he glimpsed a terrible thing. He had thought it for some moments a range of black mountains, but now he saw it was something more. The phosphorescence of the brooding clouds shewed it plainly, and even silhouetted parts of it as vapors glowed behind. How distant it was he could not tell, but it must have been very far. It was thousands of feet high, stretching in a great concave arc from the gray, impassable peaks to the unimagined westward spaces, and had once indeed been a ridge of mighty onyx hills. But now these hills were no more, for some hand greater than man's had touched them. Silent they squatted there atop the world like wolves or ghouls, crowned with cloud and mist and guarding the secrets of the north forever. All in a great half-circle they squatted, those dog-like mountains carven into monstrous watching statues, and their right hands were raised in menace against mankind. It was only the flickering light of the clouds that made their mitered double-heads seem to move. It was only the flickering light of the clouds that made their mitered double-heads seem to move. But as Carter stumbled on, he saw rise from their shadowy caps great forms whose motions were no delusion. Winged and whirring, those forms grew larger each moment, and the traveler knew his stumbling was at an end. They were not any birds or bats known elsewhere on earth or in Dreamland, for they were larger than elephants, and had heads like a horse's. Carter knew that they must be the Shantak birds of ill rumor, and wondered no more what evil guardians and nameless sentinels made men avoid the boreal rock desert. And as he stopped in final resignation, he dared at last to look behind him, where indeed was trotting the squat, slant-eyed traitor of evil legend, grinning astride a lean yak, and leading on a noxious horde of leering Shantaks, to whose wings still clung the rime and niter of the nether pits. trapped as he was by fabulous and hippocephalic winged nightmares that pressed around in great unholy circles, Randolph Carter did not lose consciousness. Lofty and horrible, those titan gargoyles towered above him, while the slant-eyed merchant leaped down from his yak and stood grinning before the captive. Then the man motioned Carter to mount one of the repugnant shantaks, helping him up as his judgment struggled with his loathing. It was hard work ascending, for the shantak bird had scales instead of feathers, and those scales are very slippery. Once he was seated, the slant-eyed man hopped up behind him, leaving the lean yak to be led away northward toward the ring of carven mountains by one of the incredible bird colossi. There now followed a hideous whirl through frigid space, endlessly up and eastward, toward the gaunt gray flanks of those impassable mountains, beyond which Leng was said to be. Far above the clouds they flew, till at last lay beneath them those fabled summits which the folk of Inquanok had never seen, which always lie in high vortices of gleaming mist. Carter beheld them very plainly as they passed below, and saw upon their topmost peaks strange caves which made him think of those on Ingranek. But he did not question his captor about these things when he noticed that both the man and the horse-headed shantak appeared oddly fearful of them, hurrying past nervously and shewing great tension until they were far in the rear. The shantak now flew lower, revealing beneath the canopy of cloud a gray barren plain, whereon at great distances shone little feeble fires. As they descended, there appeared at intervals lone huts of granite and bleak stone villages, whose tiny windows glowed with pallid light. And there came from those huts and villages a shrill droning of pipes and a nauseous rattle of crotala, which proved at once that Inquanok's people are right in their geographic rumors. For travelers have heard such sounds before, and know that they float only from the cold desert plateau which healthy folk never visit, that haunted place of evil and mystery, which is Leng. Around the feeble fires, dark forms were dancing, and Carter was curious as to what manner of beings it might be, for no healthy folk have ever been to Leng, and the place is only known by its fires and stone huts as seen from afar. Very slowly and awkwardly did those forms leap, and with an insane twisting and bending not good to behold, so that Carter did not wonder at the monstrous evil imputed to them by vague legend, or the fear in which all Dreamland holds their abhorrent frozen plateau. As the shantak flew lower, the repulsiveness of the dancers became tinged with a certain hellish familiarity, and the prisoner kept straining his eyes and racking his memory for clues to where he had seen such creatures before. They leaped as though they had hooves instead of feet, and seemed to wear a sort of wig or headpiece with small horns. Of other clothing they had none, but most of them were quite furry. Behind they had dwarfish tails, and when they glanced upward, he saw the excessive width of their mouths. Then he knew what they were, and that they did not wear any wigs or headpieces after all, for the cryptic folk of Leng were of one race with the uncomfortable merchants of the black galleys that traded rubies at Dylath-Leen, those not quite human merchants who were the slaves of the monstrous moon things. They were indeed the same dark folk who had shanghaied Carter on their noisome galley so long ago, and whose kith he had seen driven in herds about the unclean wharves of that accursed lunar city, with the leaner ones toiling, and the fatter ones taken away in crates for other needs of their polypous and amorphous masters. Now he saw where such ambiguous creatures came from, and shuddered at the thought that Leng must be known to these formless abominations from the moon. But the shantak flew on past the fires, and the stone huts, and the less-than-human dancers, and soared over sterile hills of gray granite, and dim wastes of rock and ice and snow. Day came, and the phosphorescence of low clouds gave place to the misty twilight of that northern world, and still the vile bird winged meaningly through the cold and silence. At times the slant-eyed man talked with his steed in a hateful and guttural language, and the shantak would answer with tittering tones that rasped like the scratching of ground glass. All the while, the land was getting higher, and finally they came to a wind-swept tableland which seemed the very roof of a blasted and tenantless world. There, all alone in the hush and the dusk and the cold, rose the uncouth stones of a squat windowless building, around which a circle of crude monoliths stood. In all this arrangement there was nothing human, and Carter surmised from old tales that he was indeed come to that most dreadful and legendary of all places, the remote and prehistoric monastery, wherein dwells uncompanioned the high priest not to be described, which wears a yellow silken mask over its face and prays to the other gods and their crawling chaos Nyarlathotep. The loathsome bird now settled to the ground, and the slant-eyed man hopped down and helped his captive alight. Of the purpose of his seizure, Carter now felt very sure, for clearly the slant-eyed merchant was an agent of the darker powers, eager to drag before his masters a mortal whose presumption had aimed at the finding of unknown Kadath and the saying of a prayer before the faces of the great old ones in their onyx castle. It seemed likely that this merchant had caused his former capture by the slaves of the moon things in Dylath-Leen, and that he now meant to do what the rescuing cats had baffled, taking the victim to some dread rendezvous with monstrous Nyarlathotep, and telling with what boldness the seeking of unknown Kadath had been tried. Leng and the cold waste north of Inquinach must be close to the other gods, and there the passes of Kadath are well guarded. The slant-eyed man was small, but the great hippocephalic bird was there to see he was obeyed, so Carter followed where he led, and passed within the circle of standing rocks, and into the low-arched doorway of that windowless stone monastery. There were no lights inside, but the evil merchant lit a small clay lamp bearing morbid bas-reliefs, and prodded his prisoner on through mazes of narrow, winding corridors. On the walls of the corridors were printed frightful scenes older than history, and in a style unknown to the archaeologists of Earth. After countless aeons their pigments were brilliant still, for the cold and dryness of hideous Leng kept alive many primal things. Carter saw them fleetingly in the rays of that dim and moving lamp, and shuddered at the tale they told. Through those archaic frescoes, Leng's annals stalked, and the horned-hooved and wide-mouthed almost humans danced evilly amidst forgotten cities. There were scenes of old wars wherein Leng's almost humans fought with the bloated purple spiders of the neighboring vales, and there were scenes also of the coming of the black galleys from the moon, and the submission of Leng's people to the polypus and amorphous blasphemies that hopped and floundered and wriggled out of them. Those slippery grayish-white blasphemies they worshipped as gods, nor ever complained when scores of their best and fatted males were taken away in the black galleys. The monstrous moon beasts made their camp on a jagged isle in the sea, and Carter could tell from the frescoes that this was none other than the lone nameless rock he had seen when sailing to Inquinach, that gray accursed rock which Inquinach's seamen shun, and from which vile howlings reverberate all through the night. And in those frescoes was shewn the great seaport and capital of the almost humans, proud and pillared betwixt the cliffs and the basalt wharves, and wondrous with high fanes and carven places. Great gardens and columned streets led from the cliffs and from each of the 6 sphinx-crowned gates to a vast central plaza, and in that plaza was a pair of winged colossal lions guarding the top of a subterrene staircase. Again and again there were those huge winged lions shewn, their mighty flanks of diorite glistening in the gray twilight of the day and the cloudy phosphorescence of the night. And as Carter stumbled past their frequent and repeated pictures, it came to him at last what indeed they were. And as Carter stumbled past their frequent and repeated pictures, it came to him at last what indeed they were, and what city it was that the almost humans had ruled so anciently before the coming of the Black Galleons. There could be no mistake, for the legends of Dreamland are generous and profuse. Indubitably, that primal city was no less a place than storied Sarkomond, whose ruins had bleached for 1,000,000 years before the first true human saw the light, and whose twin Titan lions guard eternally the steps that lead down from Dreamland to the great abyss. Other views shewed the gaunt gray peaks dividing Leng from Inquinac, and the monstrous shantak birds that built nests on the ledges halfway up, and they shewed likewise the curious caves near the very topmost pinnacles, and how even the boldest of the shantaks fly screaming away from them. Carter had seen those caves when he passed over them, and had noticed their likeness to the caves on Ingranek. Now he knew that the likeness was more than a chance one, for in these pictures were shewn their fearsome denizens, and those bat wings, curving horns, barbed tails, prehensile paws, and rubbery bodies were not strange to him. He had met those silent, flitting, and clutching creatures before, those mindless guardians of the great abyss whom even the great ones fear, and who own not Nyarlathotep, but hoary Nodens as their lord. For they were the dreaded night gaunts, who never laugh or smile, because they have no faces, and who flop unendingly in the dark betwixt the vale of Panath and the passes to the outer world. The slant-eyed merchant had now prodded Carter into a great domed space, whose walls were carved in shocking bas-reliefs, and whose center held a gaping circular pit surrounded by 6 malignly stained stone altars in a ring. There was no light in this vast, evil-smelling crypt, and the small lamp of the sinister merchant shone so feebly that one could barely grasp details, only little by little. At the farther end was a high stone dais, reached by 5 steps, and there on a golden throne sat a lumpish figure robed in yellow silk, figured with red, and having a yellow silken mask over its face. To this being, the slant-eyed man made certain signs with his hands, and the lurker in the dark replied by raising a disgustingly carven flute of ivory in silk-covered paws, and blowing certain loathsome sounds from beneath its flowing yellow mask. This colloquy went on for some time, and to Carter there was something sickeningly familiar in the sound of that flute, and the stench of the malodorous place. It made him think of a frightful red-litten city, and of the revolting procession that once filed through it. Of that, and of an awful climb through lunar countryside beyond, before the rescuing rush of Earth's friendly cats. He knew that creature on the dais was without doubt the high priest not to be described, of which legend whispers such fiendish and abnormal possibilities. But he feared to think just what that abhorred high priest might be. Then that figured silk slipped a trifle from one of the grayish-white paws, and Carter knew what the noisome high priest was. And in that hideous second, stark fear drove him to something his reason would never have dared to attempt, for in all his shaken consciousness there was room only for one frantic will to escape from what squatted on that golden throne. He knew that hopeless labyrinth of stone lay betwixt him and the cold tableland outside, and that even on the tableland the noxious shantak still waited. Yet in spite of all of this, there was in his mind only the instant need to get away from that wriggling, silk-robed monstrosity. The slant-eyed man had set the curious lamp upon one of the high and wickedly stained altar stones by the pit, and then moved forward somewhat to talk with the high priest with his hands. Carter, hitherto wholly passive, now gave that man a terrific push with all the wild strength of fear, so that the victim toppled at once into that gaping well, which rumor holds to reach down to the hellish vaults of Zin, where Googs hunt ghast in the dark. In almost the same second, he seized the lamp from the altar and darted out into the frescoed labyrinth, racing this way and that as chance determined, and trying not to think of the stealthy padding of shapeless paws on the stones behind him, or of the silent wrigglings and crawlings which must be going on back there in lightless corridors. After a few moments, he regretted his thoughtless haste, and wished he had tried to follow backward the frescoes he had passed on the way in. True, they were so confused and duplicated that they could not have done him much good. He wished nonetheless he had made the attempt. Those he now saw were even more horrible than those he had seen then, and he knew he was not on the corridors leading outside. In time, he became quite sure that he was not followed, and slackened his pace somewhat. But scarce had he breathed in half relief, when a new peril beset him. His lamp was waning, and he would soon be in pitch blackness with no means of sight or guidance. When the light was all gone, he groped slowly in the dark, and prayed to the great ones for such help as they might afford. At times, he felt the stone floor sloping up or down, and once he stumbled over a step for which no reason seemed to exist. The farther he went, the damper it seemed to be, and when he was able to feel a junction or the mouth of a side passage, he always chose the way which sloped downward the least. He believed, though, that his general course was down, and the vault-like smell and incrustations on the greasy walls and floors alike warned him that he was burrowing deep into Lang's unwholesome tableland. But there was not any warning of the thing which came at last, only the thing itself with its terror and shock and breathtaking chaos. One moment he was groping slowly over the slippery floor of an almost level place, and next he was shooting dizzily downward in the dark through a burrow which must have been well-nigh vertical. Of the length of that hideous sliding he could not be sure, but it seemed to take hours of delirious nausea and ecstatic frenzy. Then he realized he was still, with the phosphorescent clouds of a northern night shining sickly above him. All around were crumbling walls and broken columns, and the pavement on which he lay was pierced by straggling grass and wrenched asunder by frequent shrubs and roots. Behind him, a basalt cliff rose topless and perpendicular, its dark sides sculptured into repellent scenes, and pierced by an arched and carven entrance to the inner blackness out of which he had come. Ahead stretched double rows of pillars, and the fragments and pedestals of pillars that spoke of a broad and bygone street, and from the urns and basins along the way he knew it had been a great street of gardens. Far off at its end the pillars spread to mark a vast round plaza, and in that open circle there loomed gigantic under the lurid night clouds a pair of monstrous things. Huge winged lions of diorite they were, with blackness and shadow between them. Full 20 feet they reared their grotesque and unbroken heads, and snarled derisive on the ruins around them. And Carter knew right well what they must be, for legends tell of only one such twain. They were the changeless guardians of the great abyss, and these dark ruins were in truth primordial Sarkomand. Carter's first act was to close and barricade the archway in the cliff with fallen blocks and odd debris that lay around. He wished no follower from Lang's hateful monastery, for along the way would lurk enough of other dangers. Of how to get from Sarkomand to the peopled parts of Dreamland, he knew nothing at all, nor could he gain much by descending to the grottos of the ghouls, since he knew they were no better informed than he. The three ghouls which had helped him through the city of Gugs to the outer world had not known how to reach Sarkomand in their journey back, but had planned to ask old traders of Dylath-Leen. He did not like to think of going again to the subterrene world of Gugs, and risking once more that hellish tower of Koth, with its cyclopean steps leading to the enchanted wood, and he felt he might have to try this course, if all else failed. Over Lang's plateaus past the lone monastery, he dared not go unaided, for the high priest's emissaries must be many, while at the journey's end there would no doubt be the Shantax and perhaps other things to deal with. If he could get a boat, he might sail back to Inquinoc past the jagged and hideous rock in the sea, where the primal frescoes of the monastery labyrinth had shewn that this frightful place lies not far from Sarkamon's basalt quays. But to find a boat in this aeon-deserted city was no probable thing, and it did not appear likely that he could ever make one. Such were the thoughts of Randolph Carter, when a new impression began beating upon his mind. All this while there had stretched before him the great corpse-like width of fabled Sarkamond, with its black broken pillars and crumbling sphinx-crowned gates, and titan stones and monstrous winged lions against the sickly glow of those luminous night clouds. Now he saw far ahead and on the right a glow that no clouds could account for, and knew he was not alone in the silence of that dense city. The glow rose and fell fitfully, flickering with a greenish tinge which did not reassure the watcher. And when he crept closer, down the littered street and through some narrow gaps between tumbled walls, he perceived that it was a campfire near the wharves, with many vague forms clustered darkly around it, and a lethal odor hanging heavily over all. Beyond was the oily lapping of the harbor water, with a great ship riding at anchor, and Carter paused in stark terror when he saw that the ship was indeed one of those dreaded black galleys from the moon. Then, just as he was about to creep back from that detestable flame, he saw a stirring among the vague dark forms and heard a peculiar and unmistakable sound. It was the frightened meeping of a ghoul, and in a moment it had swelled to a veritable chorus of anguish. Secure as he was in the shadow of monstrous ruins, Carter allowed his curiosity to conquer his fear, and crept forward again instead of retreating. Once in a crossing in an open street, he wriggled worm-like on his stomach, and in another place he had to rise to his feet to avoid making a noise among heaps of fallen marble. But always he succeeded in avoiding discovery, so that in a short time he had found a spot behind a titan pillar, where he could watch the whole green-litten scene of action. There, around a hideous fire fed by the obnoxious stems of lunar fungi, there squatted a stinking circle of the toad-like moon beasts, and their almost human slaves. Some of these slaves were heating curious iron spears in the leaping flames, and at intervals applying their white-hot points to three tightly trussed prisoners that lay writhing before the leaders of the party. From the motions of their tentacles, Carter could see that the blunt-snouted moon beasts were enjoying the spectacle hugely, and vast was his horror when he suddenly recognized the frantic meeping and knew that the tortured ghouls were none other than the faithful trio which had guided him safely from the abyss, and had thereafter set out from the enchanted wood to find Sarkamond and the gate to their native deeps. The number of malodorous moon beasts about that greenish fire was very great, and Carter saw that he could do nothing now to save his former allies. Of how the ghouls had been captured he could not guess. He fancied that the great toad-like blasphemies had heard them inquire in Dylath-Leen concerning the way to Sarkamond, and had not wished them to approach so closely the hateful plateau of Leng and the high priest not to be described. For a moment he pondered on what he ought to do, and recalled how near he was to the gate of the ghouls' black kingdom. Clearly, it was wisest to creep east to the Plaza of Twin Lions and descend at once to the gulf, where assuredly he would meet no horrors worse than those above, and where he might soon find ghouls eager to rescue their brethren, and perhaps to wipe out the moon beast from the black galley. It occurred to him that the portal, like other gates to the abyss, might be guarded by flocks of night gaunts, but he did not fear these faceless creatures now. He had learned that they are bound by solemn treaties with the ghouls, and the ghoul which was Pickman had taught him how to glibber a password they understood. So Carter began another silent crawl through the ruins, edging slowly toward the great central plaza and the winged lions. It was ticklish work, but the moon beasts were pleasantly busy, and did not hear the slight noises which he twice made by accident among the scattered stones. At last he reached the open space and picked his way among the stunned trees and vines that had grown up therein. The gigantic lions loomed terrible above him in the sickly glow of the phosphorescent night clouds, but he manfully persisted toward them, and presently crept round to their faces, knowing it was on that side he would find the mighty darkness which they guard. 10 feet apart crouched the mocking-faced beasts of diorite, brooding on cyclopean pedestals whose sides were chiseled in fearsome bas-reliefs. Betwixt them was a tiled court with essential space, which had once been railed with balusters of onyx. Midway in this space, the black well opened, and Carter soon saw that he had indeed reached the yawning gulf whose crusted and mouldy stone steps lead down to the crypts of nightmare. Terrible is the memory of that dark descent in which hours wore themselves away, whilst Carter wound sightlessly round and round down a fathomless spiral of steep and slippery stairs. So worn and narrow were the steps, and so greasy with the ooze of inner earth, that the climber never quite knew when to expect a breathless fall and hurtling down to the ultimate pits. And he was likewise uncertain just when or how the guardian night-gaunts would suddenly pounce upon him, if indeed there were any station in this primeval passage. All about him was a stifling odor of nether gulfs, and he felt the air of these choking depths was not made for mankind. In time, he became very numb and somnolent, moving more from automatic impulse than from reasoned will, nor did he realize any change when he stopped moving altogether, as something quietly seized him from behind. He was flying very rapidly through the air, before a malevolent tickling told him that the rubbery night-gaunts had performed their duty. Awaked to the fact that he was in the cold, damp clutch of the faceless flutterers, Carter remembered the password of the ghouls, and gibbered it as loudly as he could amidst the wind and chaos of flight. Mindless though night-gaunts are said to be, the effect was instantaneous, for all tickling stopped at once, and the creatures hastened to shift their captive to a more comfortable position. Thus encouraged, Carter ventured some explanations, telling of the seizure and torture of 3 ghouls by the moon-beast, and of the need of assembling a party to rescue them. The night-gaunts, though inarticulate, seemed to understand what he said, and shewed greater haste and purpose in their flight. Suddenly, the dense blackness gave place to the gray twilight of inner earth, and there opened up ahead one of those flat, sterile plains on which ghouls love to squat and gnaw. Scattered tombstones and osseous fragments told of the denizens of that place, and as Carter gave a loud meep of urgent summons, a score of burrows emptied forth with their leathery dog-headed tenants. The night-gaunts now flew low, and set their passenger upon his feet, afterward withdrawing a little, and forming a hunched semicircle on the ground, while the ghouls greeted the newcomer. Carter delivered his message rapidly and explicitly to the grotesque company, and 4 of them at once departed through different burrows to spread the news to others, and gather such troops as might be available for a rescue. After a long wait, a ghoul of some importance appeared and made significant signs to the night-gaunts, causing 2 of the latter to fly off into the dark. Thereafter there were constant accessions to the hunched flock of night-gaunts on the plain, till at length the slimy soil was fairly black with them. Meanwhile, fresh ghouls crawled out of the burrows one by one, all glibbering excitedly and forming in crude battle array not far from the huddled night-gaunts. In time, there appeared that proud and influential ghoul which was once the artist Richard Pickman of Boston, and to him Carter delivered a very full account of what had occurred. The erstwhile Pickman, pleased to greet his ancient friend again, seemed very much impressed, and held a conference with the other chiefs a little apart from the growing throng. Finally, after scanning the ranks with care, the assembled chiefs all meeped in unison and began glibbering orders to the crowds of ghouls and night-gaunts. A large detachment of the horned flyers vanished at once, while the rest grouped themselves 2 by 2 on their knees with extended forelegs, awaiting the approach of the ghouls one by one. As each ghoul reached the pair of night-gaunts to which he was assigned, he was taken up and borne away into the blackness, till at last the whole throng had vanished save for Carter, Pickman, and the other chiefs, and a few pairs of night-gaunts. Pickman explained that night-gaunts are the advanced guards and battle-steeds of the ghouls, and that the army was issuing forth to Sarkaman to deal with the moon-beasts. Then Carter and the ghoulish chiefs approached the waiting bearers, and were taken up by the damp, slippery paws. Another moment, and all were whirling in wind and darkness, endlessly up, 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 to the gate of the winged and the special ruins of primal Sarkomond. When, after a great interval, Carter saw again the sickly line of Sarkomond's nocturnal sky, it was to behold the great central plaza swarming with militant ghouls and night gaunts. They, he felt sure, must be almost due, but so strong was the army that no surprise of the enemy would be needed. The greenish flare near the wharves still glimmered faintly, though the absence of ghoulish meeping shewed that the torture of the prisoners was over for the nonce. Softly glibbering directions to their steeds and to the flock of riderless night-gaunts ahead, the ghouls presently rose in wide whirring columns and swept on over the bleak ruins toward the evil flame. Carter was now beside Pickman in the front rank of ghouls, and saw as they approached the noisome camp that the moon beasts were totally unprepared. The three prisoners lay bound and inert beside the fire, while their toad-like captors slumped drowsily about in no certain order. The almost human slaves were asleep, even the sentinels shirking a duty which in this realm must have seemed to them merely perfunctory. The final swoop of the night-gaunts and mounted ghouls was very sudden, each of the grayish toad-like blasphemies and their almost human slaves being seized by a group of night-gaunts before a sound was made. The moon beasts, of course, were voiceless, and even the slaves had little chance to scream before rubbery paws choked them into silence. Horrible were the writhings of those great jellyfish abnormalities as the sardonic night-gaunts clutched them, but nothing availed against the strength of those black, prehensile talons. When a moon beast writhed too violently, a night-gaunt would seize and pull its quivering, peaked tentacles, which seemed to hurt so much that the victim would cease its struggles. Carter expected to see much slaughter, but found the ghouls were far subtler in their plans. They delivered certain simple orders to the night-gaunts which held the captives, trusting the rest to instinct, and soon the hapless creatures were borne silently away into the great abyss, to be distributed impartially amongst the holes, gugs, ghasts, and other dwellers in darkness whose modes of nourishment are not painless for their chosen victims. Meanwhile, the three bound ghouls had been released and consoled by their conquering kinsfolk, whilst various parties searched the neighborhood for possible remaining moon beasts, and boarded the evil-smelling black galley at the wharf to make sure that nothing had escaped the general defeat. Surely enough, the capture had been thorough, for not a sign of further life could the victors detect. Carter, anxious to preserve a means of access to the rest of Dreamland, urged them not to sink the anchored galley, and this request was freely granted out of gratitude for his act in reporting the plight of the captured trio. On the ship were found some very curious objects and decorations, some of which Carter cast at once into the sea. Ghouls and night-gaunts now formed themselves in separate groups, the former questioning their fellow anent past happenings. It appeared that the three had followed Carter's directions, then proceeded from the enchanted wood to Dylath-Leen by way of Near-in-the-Sky, stealing human clothes at a lonely farmhouse and loping as closely as possible in the fashion of a man's walk. In Dylath-Leen's taverns, their grotesque ways and faces had aroused much comment, but they had persisted in asking the way to Sarkomond until at last an old traveler was able to tell them. Then they knew that only a ship for Lag-Lang would serve their purpose, and prepared to wait patiently for such a vessel. But evil spies had doubtless reported much, for shortly a black galley put into port, and the wide-mouthed ruby merchants invited the ghouls to drink with them in a tavern. Wine was produced from one of those sinister bottles grotesquely carven from a single ruby, and after that the ghouls found themselves prisoners on the black galley as Carter had found himself. This time, however, the unseen rowers steered not for the moon, but for antique Sarkomond, bent evidently on taking their captives before the high priest not to be described. They had touched at the jagged rock in the northern sea, which Inquinox mariners shun, and the ghouls had there seen for the first time the red masters of the ship, being sickened despite their own callousness by such extremes of malign shapelessness and fearsome odor. There, too, were witnessed the nameless pastimes of the toad-like resident garrison, such pastimes as give rise to the night howlings which men fear. After that had come the landing at ruined Sarkomond and the beginning of the tortures, whose continuance the present rescue had prevented. Future plans were next discussed, the three rescued ghouls suggesting a raid on the jagged rock and the extermination of the toad-like garrison there. To this, however, the night gaunts objected, since the prospect of flying over water did not please them. Most of the ghouls favored the design, but were at a loss to follow it without the help of the winged night gaunts. Thereupon, Carter, seeing that they could not navigate the anchored galley, offered to teach them the use of the great banks of oars, to which proposal they eagerly assented. Gray day had now come, and under that leaden northern sky, a picked detachment of ghouls filed into the noisome ship and took their seats on the rowers' benches. Carter found them fairly apt at learning, and before night had risked several experimental trips around the harbor. Not till 3 days later, however, did he deem it safe to attempt the voyage of conquest. Then the rowers trained, and the night gaunts safely stowed in the forecastle, the party set sail at last, Pickman and the other chiefs gathering on deck and discussing models of approach and procedure. On the very first night, the howlings from the rock were heard. Such was their timber that all the galley's crew shook visibly, but most of all trembled the three rescued ghouls who knew precisely what those howlings meant. It was not thought best to attempt an attack by night, so the ship lay to under the phosphorescent clouds to wait for the dawn of a grayish day. The sides of the rock were very steep, but on ledges here and there could be seen the bulging walls of queer windowless dwellings and the low railings guarding traveled high roads. No ship of men had ever come so near to the place, or at least, had never come so near and departed again. But Carter and the ghouls were void of fear and kept inflexibly on, rounding the eastern face of the rock, and seeking the wharves which the rescued trio described as being on the southern side within a harbor formed of steep headlands. The headlands were prolongations of the island proper, and came so closely together that only one ship at a time might pass between them. There seemed to be no watchers on the outside, so the galley was steered boldly through the flume-like strait and into the stagnant, putrid harbor beyond. Here, however, all the bustle and activity, with several ships lying at anchor along a forbidding stone quay, and scores of almost human slaves and moon beasts by the waterfront handling crates and boxes, or driving nameless and fabulous horrors hitched to lumbering lorries. There was a small stone town hewn out of the vertical cliffs above the wharves, with the start of a winding road that spiraled out of sight toward higher ledges of the rock. Of what lay inside that prodigious peak of granite, none might say, but the things one saw on the outside were far from encouraging. At sight of the incoming galley, the crowds on the wharves displayed much eagerness, those with eyes staring intently, and those without eyes wriggling their pink tentacles expectantly. They did not, of course, realize that the black ship had changed hands, for ghouls look much like the horned and hooved almost humans, and the night gaunts were all out of sight below. By this time the leaders had fully formed a plan, which was to loose the night gaunts as soon as the wharf was touched, and then to sail directly away, leaving matters wholly to the instincts of those almost mindless creatures. Marooned on the rock, the horned flyers would first of all seize whatever living things they found there, and afterward, quite helpless to think except in terms of the homing instinct, would forget their fears of water and fly swiftly back to the abyss, bearing their noisome prey to appropriate destination in the dark, from which not much would emerge alive. The ghoul that was Pickman now went below and gave the night gaunts their simple instructions, while the ship drew very near to the ominous and malodorous wharves. Presently a fresh stir rose along the waterfront, and Carter saw that the motions of the galley had begun to excite suspicion. Evidently the steersman was not making for the right dock, and probably the watchers had noticed the difference between the hideous ghouls and the almost human slaves whose places they were taking. Some silent alarm must have been given, for almost at once a horde of the mephitic moon beasts began to pour from the little black doorways of the windowless houses and down the winding road at the right. A rain of curious javelins struck the galley as the prow hit the wharf, felling 2 ghouls and slightly wounding another. But at this point, all the hatches were thrown open to emit a black cloud of whirring night gaunts, which swarmed over the town like a flock of horned and cyclopean bats. The jellyish moon beasts had procured a great pole and were trying to push off the invading ship, but when the night gaunts struck them, they thought of all such things no more. It was a very terrible spectacle to see those faceless and rubbery ticklers at their pastime, and tremendously impressive to watch the dense cloud of them spreading through the town and up the winding roadway to the reaches above. Sometimes a group of the black flutterers would drop a toad-like prisoner from aloft by mistake, and the manner in which the victim would burst was highly offensive to the sight and smell. When the last of the night gaunts had left the galley, the ghoulish leaders glibbered an order of withdrawal, and the rowers pulled quietly out of the harbor between the gray headlands, while still the town was a chaos of battle and conquest. The Pikmin ghoul allowed several hours for the night gaunts to make up their rudimentary minds and overcome their fear of flying over the sea, and kept the galley standing about a mile off the jagged rock as he waited, and dressed the wounds of the injured men. Night fell, and the gray twilight gave place to the sickly phosphorescence of low clouds, and all the while the leaders watched the high peaks of that accursed rock for signs of the night gaunt's flight. Toward morning, a black speck was seen hovering timidly over the topmost pinnacle, and shortly afterward the speck had become a swarm. Just before daybreak, the swarm seemed to scatter, and within a quarter of an hour it had vanished wholly in the distance toward the northeast. Once or twice, something seemed to fall from the thing's swarm into the sea, but Carter did not worry, since he knew from observation that the toad-like moon beasts cannot swim. At length, when the ghouls were satisfied that all the night gaunts had left for Sarkomond and the great abyss with their doomed burdens, the galley put into the harbor betwixt the gray headlands, and all the hideous company landed and roamed curiously over the denuded rock, with its towers and eyries and fortresses chiseled from the solid stone. Frightful were the secrets uncovered in those evil and windowless crypts, for the remnants of unfinished pastimes were many, and in various stages of departure from their primal state. Carter put out of the way certain things which were after a fashion alive, and fled precipitately from a few other things about which he could not be very positive. The stench-filled houses were furnished mostly with grotesque stools and benches carven from moon trees, and were painted inside with nameless and frantic designs. Countless weapons, implements, and ornaments lay about, including some large idols of solid ruby depicting singular beings not found on the earth. These latter did not, despite their material, invite either appropriation or long inspection, and Carter took the trouble to hammer 5 of them into very small pieces. The scattered spears and javelins he collected, and with Pikmin's approval, distributed among the ghouls. Such devices were new to the dog-like lopers, but their relative simplicity made them easy to master after a few concise hints. The upper parts of the rock held more temples than private homes, and in numerous hewn chambers were found terrible carven altars, and doubtfully stained fonts and shrines for the worship of things more monstrous than the wild gods atop Kadath. From the rear of one great temple stretched a low black passage which Carter followed far into the rock with a torch till he came to a lightless domed hall of vast proportions, whose vaultings were covered with demoniac carvings, and in whose center yawned a foul and bottomless well like that in the hideous monastery of Leng, where broods alone the high priest not to be described. On the distant shadowy side, beyond the noisome well, he thought he discerned a small door of strangely wrought bronze, and for some reason he felt an unaccountable dread of opening it, or even approaching it, and hastened back through the cavern to his lovely allies, as they shambled about with an ease and abandon he could scarcely feel. The ghouls had observed the unfinished pastimes of the moon beasts, and had profited in their fashion. They'd also found a hogshead of potent moon wine, and were rolling it down to the wharves for removal, and later use in diplomatic dealings, though the rescued trio, remembering its effect on them in Dylath-Leen, had warned their company to taste none of it. Of rubies from lunar mines, there was a great store, both rough and polished, in one of the vaults near the water, but when the ghouls found they were not good to eat, they lost all interest in them. Carter did not try to carry any away, since he knew too much about those which had mined them. Suddenly, there came an excited meeping from the sentries on the wharves, and all the loathsome foragers turned from their tasks to stare seaward and cluster around the waterfront. Betwixt the gray headlands, a fresh black galley was rapidly advancing, and would be but a moment before the almost humans on deck would perceive the invasion of the town and give alarm to the monstrous things below. Fortunately, the ghouls still bore spears and javelins which Carter had distributed amongst them, and at his command, sustained by the being that was Pickman, they now formed a line of battle and prepared to prevent the landing of the ship. Presently, a burst of excitement on the galley told of the crew's discovery of the changed state of things, and the instant stoppage of the vessel proved that the superior numbers of the ghouls had been noted and taken into account. After a moment of hesitation, the newcomers silently turned and passed out between the headlands again. But not for an instant did the ghouls imagine that the conflict was averted. Either the dark ship would seek reinforcements, or the crew would try to land elsewhere on the island. Hence a party of scouts was at once sent up toward the pinnacle to see what the enemy's course would be. In a very few minutes the ghoul returned breathless to say that the moon beasts and almost humans were landing on the outside of the more easterly of the rugged gray headlands, and ascending by hidden paths and ledges which a goat could scarcely tread in safety. Almost immediately afterward, the galley was sighted again through the flume-like strait, but only for a second. Then, a few moments later, the second messenger panted down from aloft to say that another party was landing on the other headland, both being much more numerous than the size of the galley would seem to allow for. The ship itself, moving slowly with only one sparsely manned tier of oars, soon hove in sight betwixt the cliffs, and lay to in the fetid harbor as if to watch the coming fray and stand by for any possible use. By this time, Carter and Pickman had divided the ghouls into 3 parties, one to meet each of the 2 invading columns, and one to remain in the town. The first 2 at once scrambled up the rocks in their respective directions, while the third was subdivided into a land party and a sea party. The sea party, commanded by Carter, boarded the anchored galley and rowed out to meet the undermanned galley of the newcomers, whereat the latter retreated through the strait to the open sea. Carter did not at once pursue it, for he knew that he might be needed more acutely near the town. Meanwhile, the frightful detachments of the moon beasts and almost humans had lumbered up to the top of the headlands, and were shockingly silhouetted on either side against the gray twilight sky. The thin, hellish flutes of the invaders had now begun to whine, and the general effect of those hybrid, half-amorphous processions was as nauseating as the actual odor given off by the toad-like lunar blasphemies. Then the 2 parties of the ghouls swarmed into sight and joined the silhouetted panorama. Javelins began to fly from both sides, and the swelling meeps of the ghouls and the bestial howls of the almost humans gradually joined the hellish whine of the flutes to form a frantic and indescribable chaos of diamond cacophony. Now and then, bodies fell from the narrow ridges of the headlands into the sea outside, or the harbor inside, in the latter case being sucked quickly under by certain submarine lurkers, whose presence was indicated only by prodigious bubbles. For half an hour this dual battle raged in the sky, till upon the west cliff the invaders were completely annihilated. On the east cliff, however, where the leader of the Moonbeast party appeared to be present, the ghouls had not fared so well, and were slowly retreating to the slopes of the pinnacle proper. Pickman had quickly ordered reinforcements for this front from the party in the town, and these had helped greatly in the earlier stages of the combat. Then, when the western battle was over, the victorious survivors hastened across to the aid of their hard-pressed fellows, turning the tide and forcing the invaders back again along the narrow ridge of the headland. The almost humans were by this time all slain, but the last of the toad-like horrors had fought desperately with the great spears clutched in their powerful and disgusting paws. The time for javelins was now nearly past, and the fight became a hand-to-hand contest of what few spearmen could meet upon that narrow ridge. As fury and recklessness increased, the number falling into the sea became very great. Those striking the harbor met nameless extinction from the unseen bubblers, but of those striking the open sea, some were able to swim to the foot of the cliffs and land on tidal rocks, while the hovering galley of the enemy rescued several moon beasts. The cliffs were unscalable, except where the monsters had debarked, so that none of the ghouls on the rocks could rejoin their battle line. Some were killed by javelins from the hostile galley or from the moon beasts above, but a few survived to be rescued. When the security of the land party seemed assured, Carter's galley sallied forth between the headlands and drove the hostile ship out to sea, pausing to rescue such ghouls as were on the rocks or still swimming in the ocean. Several moon beasts washed on rocks or reefs were speedily put out of the way. Finally, the moon beast galley being safely in the distance and the invading land party concentrated in one place, Carter landed a considerable force on the eastern headland in the enemy's rear, after which the fight was short-lived indeed. Attacked from both sides, the noisome flounderers were rapidly cut to pieces, or pushed into the sea, till by evening the ghoulish chiefs agreed that the island was again clear of them. The hostile galley, meanwhile, had disappeared, and it was decided that the evil jagged rock had better be evacuated before any overwhelming horde of lunar horrors might be assembled and brought against the victors. So by night, Pickman and Carter assembled all the ghouls and counted them with care, finding that over a fourth of them had been lost in the day's battles. The wounded were placed on bunks in the galley, for Pickman always discouraged the old ghoulish custom of killing and eating one's own wounded, and the able-bodied troops were assigned to the oars or to other such places as they might most usefully fill. Under the low phosphorescent clouds of night, the galley sailed, and Carter was not sorry to be departing from the island of unwholesome secrets, whose lightless domed hull with its bottomless well and repellent bronze door lingered restlessly in his fancy. Dawn found the ship in sight of Sarkamon's ruined quay of basalt, where a few night-gaunt sentries still waited, squatting like black-horned gargoyles on the broken columns and crumbling sphinxes of that fearful city which lived and died before the years of man. The ghouls made camp amongst the fallen stones of Sarkamon, dispatching a messenger for enough night-gaunts to serve them as steeds. Pickman and the other chiefs were effusive in their gratitude for the aid Carter had lent them. Carter now began to feel that his plans were indeed maturing well, and that he would be able to command the help of these fearsome allies not only in quitting this part of Dreamland, but in pursuing his ultimate quest for the gods atop unknown Kadath, and the marvelous sunset city they so strangely withheld from his slumbers. Accordingly, he spoke of these things to the ghoulish leaders, telling what he knew of the cold waste wherein Kadath stands, and of the monstrous Shantoks, and the mountains carven into double-headed images which guard it. He spoke of the fear of Shantoks from night-gaunts, and of how the vast hippocephalic birds fly screaming from the black burrows high upon the gaunt gray peaks that divide Inquanok from hateful Leng. He spoke, too, of the things he had learned concerning night-gaunts from the frescoes in the windowless monastery of the high priest not to be described, how even the great ones fear them, and how their ruler is not the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep at all, but hoary and immemorial Nodens, lord of the great abyss. All these things Carter glibbered to the assembled ghouls, and presently outlined that request which he had in mind, and which he did not think extravagant considering the services he had so lately rendered the rubbery dog-like lopers. He wished very much, he said, for the services of enough night-gaunts to bear him safely through the aft past the realm of Shantax and Carven Mountains, and up into the old waste beyond the returning tracks of any other mortal. He desired to fly to the onyx castle atop unknown Kadath in the cold waste, to plead with the great ones for the sunset city that denied him, and felt sure that the night-gaunts could take him thither without trouble, high above the perils of the plain, and over the hideous double heads of those carven sentinel mountains that squat eternally in the grey dusk. For the horned and faceless creatures there could be no danger from aught of earth, since the great ones themselves dread them, and even were unexpected things to come from the other gods, who are prone to oversee the affairs of earth's milder gods, The night-gaunts need not fear, for the outer hells are indifferent to matters to such silent and slippery flyers as own not Nyarlathotep for their master, but bow only to potent and archaic Nodens. A flock of 10 or 15 night-gaunts, Carter glibbered, would surely be enough to keep any combination of Shantoks at a distance, though perhaps it might be well to have some ghouls in the party to manage the creatures, their ways being better known to their ghoulish allies than to men. The party could land him at some convenient point within whatever walls that fabulous onyx citadel might have, waiting in the shadows for his return, or his signal, whilst he ventured inside the castle to give prayer to the gods of earth. If any ghouls chose to escort him to the throne room of the Great Ones, he would be thankful, for their presence would add weight and importance to his plea. He would not, however, insist upon this, but merely wish transportation to and from the castle atop unknown Kadath, the final journey being either to the marvelous Sunset City itself, in case of gods prove favorable, or back to the earthward gate of deep slumber in the enchanted wood, in case his prayers were fruitless. Whilst Carter was speaking, all the ghouls listened with great attention, and as the moments advanced, the sky became black with clouds of those night-gaunts for which messengers had been sent. The winged steeds settled in a semicircle around the ghoulish army, waiting respectfully as the dog-like chieftains considered the wish of the earthly traveler. The ghoul that was Pickman glibbered gravely with his fellows, and in the end, Carter was offered far more than he had at most expected. As he aided the ghouls in their conquest of the moon beasts, so would they aid him in his daring voyage to realms whence none had ever returned, lending him not merely a few of their allied night-gaunts, but the entire army as then encamped, veteran fighting ghouls and newly assembled night-gaunts alike, save only a small garrison for the captured Black Galley and such spoils as had come from the jagged rock in the sea. They would set out through the aft whenever he might wish, and once arrived on Kadath, a suitable train of ghouls would attend him in a state as he placed his petition before Earth's gods in their onyx castle. Moved by a gratitude and satisfaction beyond words, Carter made plans with the ghoulish leaders for his audacious voyage. The army would fly high, they decided, over hideous Lang, with its nameless monastery and wicked stone villages, stopping only at the vast gray peaks to confer with the Shantak frightening night-gaunts, whose burrows honeycombed their summits. They would then, according to what advice they might receive from those denizens, choose their final course, approaching unknown Kadath, either through the desert of carven mountains north of Inquinnock, or through the more northerly reaches of repulsive Lang itself. Dog-like and soulless as they are, the ghouls and night-gaunts had no dread of what those untrodden deserts might reveal, nor did they feel any deterring awe at the thought of Kadath towering lone, with its onyx castle of mystery. About midday, the ghouls and night-gaunts prepped for flight, each ghoul selecting a suitable pair of horned steeds to bear him. Carter was placed well up toward the head of the column beside Pickman, and in front of the whole, a double line of riderless night-gaunts was provided as a vanguard. At a brisk meep from Pickman, the whole shocking army rose in a nightmare cloud above the broken columns and crumbling sphinxes of primordial Sarkomond. Higher and higher, till even the great basalt cliff behind the town was cleared, and the cold, sterile tableland of Lang's outskirts laid open to sight. Still higher flew the black host, till even this tableland grew small beneath them, and as they worked northward over the wind-swept plateau of horror, Carter once saw again with a shudder the circle of crude monoliths, and the squat windowless building which he knew held that frightful silken-masked blasphemy from whose clutches he had so narrowly escaped. This time no descent was made as the army swept bat-like over the sterile landscape, passing the feeble fires of the unwholesome stone villages at a great altitude, and pausing not at all to mark the morbid twistings of the hooved, horned, almost humans that dance and pipe eternally therein. Once they saw a Shantak bird flying low over the plain, but when it saw them it screamed noxiously. It flapped off to the north in grotesque panic. At dusk, they reached the jagged gray peaks that form the barrier of Inquinoc, and hovered about these strange caves near the summits, which Carter recalled as so frightful to the Shantax. At the insistent meeping of the ghoulish leaders, there issued forth from each lofty burrow a stream of horned black flyers, with which the ghouls and night gaunts of the party conferred at length by means of ugly gestures. It soon became clear that the best course would be that over the cold waste of North Inquinoc, for Leng's northward reaches are full of unseen pitfalls that even the night gaunts dislike. Abysmal influences centering in certain white hemispherical buildings on curious knolls, which common folklore associates unpleasantly with the other gods and their crawling chaos Nyarlathotep. Of Kadath, the flutterers of the peaks knew almost nothing, save that there must be some mighty marvel toward the north, over which the Shantax and the Carven Mountains stand guard. They hinted at rumored abnormalities of proportion in those trackless leagues beyond, and recalled vague whispers of a realm where night broods eternally. But of definite data, they had nothing to give. So Carter and his party thanked them kindly, and crossing the topmost granite pinnacles to the skies of Inquinoc, dropped below the level of the phosphorescent night clouds, and beheld in the distance those terrible squatting gargoyles that were mountains till some titan hand carved fright into their virgin rock. There they squatted in a hellish half-circle, their legs on the desert sand and their miters piercing the luminous clouds, sinister, wolf-like, and double-headed, with faces of fury and right hands raised, dully and malignly watching the rim of man's world and guarding with horror the reaches of a cold northern world that is not man's. From their hideous laps rose evil Shantax of elephantine bulk, but these all fled with insane titters as the vanguard of night gaunts was sighted in the misty sky. Northward above those gargoyle mountains the army flew, and over leagues of dim desert, where never a landmark rose. Less and less luminous grew the clouds, till at length Carter could see only blackness around him. But never did the winged steeds falter, bred as they were in earth's blackest crypts, and seeing not with any eyes, but with the whole dank surface of their slippery forms. On and on they flew, past winds of dubious scent and sounds of dubious import, ever in thickest darkness, covering such prodigious spaces that Carter wondered whether or not they could still be within Earth's dreamland. Then suddenly the clouds thinned, and the stars shone spectrally above. All below was still black, but those pallid beacons in the sky seemed alive, with a meaning and directiveness they had never possessed elsewhere. It was not that the figures of the constellations were different, but that the same familiar shapes now revealed a significance they had formerly failed to make plain. Everything focused toward the north. Every curve and asterism of the glittering sky became part of a vast design whose function was to hurry first the eye, and then the whole observer, onward to some secret and terrible goal of convergence beyond the frozen waste that stretched endlessly ahead. Carter looked toward the east, where the great ridge of barrier peaks had towered along all the length of Inquinoc, and saw against the stars a jagged silhouette, which told of its continued presence. It was more broken now, with yawning clefts and fantastically erratic pinnacles, and Carter studied closely the suggestive turnings and inclinations of that grotesque outline, which seemed to share with the stars some subtle northward urge. They were flying past at a tremendous speed, so that the watcher had to strain hard to catch details, when all at once he beheld just above the line of the topmost peaks a dark and moving object against the stars, whose course exactly paralleled that of his own bizarre party. The ghouls had likewise glimpsed it, for he heard their low glibbering all about him, and for a moment he fancied the object was a gigantic shantak, of a size vastly greater than that of the average specimen. Soon, however, he saw that his theory would not hold, for the shape of the thing above the mountains was not that of any hippocephalic bird. Its outline against the stars, necessarily vague as it was, resembled rather some huge mitered head, or pair of heads infinitely magnified, and its rapid bobbing flight through the sky seemed most peculiarly a wingless one. Carter could not tell which side of the mountain it was on, but soon perceived that it had parts below the parts he had first seen, since it blotted out all the stars in places where the ridge was deeply cleft. Then came a wide gap in the range, where the hideous reaches of transmontane Lang were joined to the cold waste on this side by a low pass through which the stars shone wanly. Carter watched this gap with intense care, knowing that he might see outlined against the sky beyond it the lower parts of the vast thing that flew undulantly above the pinnacles. The object had now floated ahead a trifle, and every eye of the party was fixed on the rift where it would presently appear in full-length silhouette. Gradually, the huge thing above the peaks neared the gap, slightly slackening its speed as if conscious of its having outdistanced the ghoulish army. For another minute, suspense was keen, and in the brief instant a full silhouette and revelation came, bringing to the lips of the ghouls an awed and half-choked meep of cosmic fear, and to the soul of the traveler a chill that never wholly left it, for the mammoth bobbing shape that overtopped the ridge was only a head, a mitre double head, and below it, in terrible vastness, loped the frightful swollen body that bore it, the mountain-high monstrosity that walked in stealth and silence, the hyena-like distortion of giant anthropoid shape that trotted blackly against the sky, its repulsive pair of cone-capped heads reaching halfway to the zenith. Carter did not lose consciousness or even scream aloud, for he was an old dreamer. But he looked behind him in horror, and shuddered when he saw that there were other monstrous heads silhouetted above the level of the peaks, bobbing along stealthily after the first one, and straight in the rear were three of the mighty mountain shapes seen full against the southern stars, tiptoeing wolf-like and lumbering, their tall mitres nodding thousands of feet in the aft. The carven mountains, then, had not stayed squatting in that rigid semicircle north of Inquinoc, with right hands uplifted. They had duties to perform, and were not remiss. But it was horrible that they never spoke, and never even made a sound in walking. Meanwhile, the ghoul that was Pickman had gibbered an order to the night gaunts, and the whole army soared higher into the air. Up toward the stars the grotesque column shot, till nothing stood out any longer against the sky, neither the gray granite ridge that was still, nor the carven mitred mountains that walked. All was blackness beneath, as the fluttering legions surged northward amidst rushing winds and invisible laughter in the aether, and never a shantak or less mentionable entity rose from the haunted wastes to pursue them. The farther they went, the faster they flew, till soon their dizzying speed seemed to pass that of a rifle ball and approach that of a planet in its orbit. Carter wondered how, with such speed, the earth could still stretch beneath them, but knew that in the land of dream dimensions have strange properties. That they were in a realm of eternal night, he felt certain, and he fancied that the constellations overhead had subtly emphasized their northward focus, gathering themselves up, as it were, to cast the flying army into the void of the boreal pole, as the folds of a bag are gathered up to cast out the last bits of substance therein. Then he noticed with terror that the wings of the night gaunts were not flapping any more. The horned and faceless steeds had folded their membranous appendages, and were resting quite passive in the chaos of wind that whirled and chuckled as it bore them on. A force not of earth had seized on the army, and ghouls and night gaunts alike were powerless before a current which pulled madly and relentlessly into the north, whence no mortal had ever returned. At length a lone pallid light was seen on the skyline ahead, thereafter rising steadily as they approached, and having beneath it a black mass that blotted out the stars. Carter saw that it must be some beacon on a mountain, for only a mountain could rise so vast as seen from so prodigious a height in the air. Higher and higher rose the light and the blackness beneath it, till all the northern sky was obscured by the rugged comical mass. Lofty as the army was, the pale and sinister beacon rose above it, towering monstrous over all peaks and concernments of earth, and tasting the atomless aether where the cryptical moon and the mad planets reel. No mountain known of man was that which loomed before them. The high clouds far below were but a fringe for its foothills. The groping dizziness of topmost air was but a girdle for its loins. Scornful and spectral climbed that bridge betwixt earth and heaven, black in eternal night, and crowned with a skint of unknown stars, whose awful and significant outline grew every moment clearer. Ghouls meeped in wonder as they saw it, and Carter shivered in fear, lest all the hunting army be dashed to pieces on the unyielding onyx of that cyclopean cliff. Higher and higher rose the light, till it mingled with the loftiest orbs of the zenith, and winked down at the flyers with lurid mockery. All the north beneath it was blackness now, dread, stony blackness from infinite depths to infinite heights, with only the pale winking beacon perched unreachably at the top of all vision. Carter studied the light more closely, and saw at last what lines its inky blackness made against the stars. There were towers on that Titan mountain top, horrible domed towers in noxious and incalculable tiers and clusters, beyond any dreamable workmanship of man, battlements and terraces of wonder and menace, all limbed tiny and black and distant against the starry skint that glowed malevolently at the uppermost rim of sight. Capping the most measureless of mountains was a castle beyond all mortal thought, and in it glowed the daemon light. Then Randolph Carter knew that his quest was done, and that he saw above him the goal of all forbidden steps and audacious visions, the fabulous, the incredible home of the great ones atop unknown Kadath. Even as he realized this thing, Carter noticed a change in the course of the helplessly wind-sucked party. They were rising abruptly now, and it was plain that the focus of their flight was the onyx castle where the pale light shone. So close was the great black mountain that its sides sped by them dizzily as they shot upward, and in the darkness they could discern nothing upon it. Vaster and vaster loomed the tenebrous towers of the nighted castle above, and Carter could see that it was well-nigh blasphemous in its immensity. Well might its stones have been quarried by nameless workmen in that horrible gulf, rent out of the rock in the hill pass north of Inquinoc, for such was its size that a man on its threshold stood even as air out on the steps of earth's loftiest fortress. The skint of unknown stars above the myriad domed turrets glowed with a sallow, sickly flare, so that a kind of twilight hung about the murky walls of slippery onyx. The pallid beacon was now seen to be a single shining window, high up in one of the loftiest towers, and as the helpless army neared the top of the mountain, Carter thought he detected unpleasant shadows flitting across the feebly luminous expanse. It was a strangely arched window, of a design wholly alien to earth. The solid rock now gave place to the giant foundations of the monstrous castle, and it seemed that the speed of the party was somewhat abated. Vast walls shot up, and there was a glimpse of a great gate through which the voyagers were swept. All was night in the Titan courtyard, and then came the deeper blackness of inmost things, as a huge arched portal engulfed the column. Vortices of cold wind surged dankly through sightless labyrinths of onyx, and Carter could never tell what cyclopean stairs and corridors lay silent along the route of his endless aerial twisting. Always upward led the terrible plunge in darkness, and never a sound, touch, or glimpse broke the dense pale of mystery. Large as the army of ghouls and nightgaunts was, it was lost in the prodigious voids of that more than earthly castle, and when at last there suddenly dawned around him the lurid light of that single tower room whose lofty window had served as a beacon, it took Carter long to discern the far wall and high, distant ceiling. and to realize that he was indeed not again in the boundless air outside. Randolph Carter had hoped to come into the throne room of the Great Ones with poise and dignity, flanked and followed by impressive lines of ghouls in ceremonial order, and offering his prayer as a free and potent master among dreamers. He had known that the Great Ones themselves are not beyond a mortal's power to cope with, and had trusted to luck that the other gods and their crawling chaos Nyarlathotep would not happen to come to their aid at the crucial moment, as they had so often done before when men sought out Earth's gods in their home or on their mountains. And with his hideous escort, he had half hoped to defy even the other gods, if need were, knowing as he did that ghouls have no masters, and that night gaunts own not Nyarlathotep, but only archaic Nodens for their lord. But now he saw that supernal Kadath in its cold waste is indeed girt with dark wonders and nameless sentinels, and that the other gods are of a surety vigilant in guarding the mild, feeble gods of earth. Void as they are of lordship over ghouls and night gaunts, the mindless, shapeless blasphemies of outer space can yet control them when they must, so that it was not in state as a free and potent master of dreamers that Randolph Carter came into the Great One's throne room with his ghouls. Swept and herded by nightmare tempests from the stars, and dogged by unseen horrors of the northern waste, all that army floated captive and helpless in the lurid light, dropping numbly to the onyx floor when by some voiceless order the winds of fright dissolved. Before no golden dais had Randolph Carter come, nor was there any august circle of crowned and haloed beings with narrow eyes, long-lobed ears, thin nose, and pointed chin, whose kinship to the carven face on Ingranak might stamp them as to those whom a dreamer might pray. Save for the one-tower room, the onyx castle atop Kadath was dark, and the masters were not there. Carter had come to unknown Kadath in the cold waste, but he had not found the gods. Yet still the lurid light glowed in that one-tower room whose size was so little less than that of all outdoors, and whose distant walls and roof were so nearly lost to sight in thin, curling mists. Earth's gods were not there, it was true, but of subtler and less visible presences there could be no lack. Where the mild gods are absent, the other gods are not unrepresented, and certainly the onyx castle of castles was far from tenantless, and wondered how close a watch had all along been kept upon him by the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep. It is Nyarlathotep, horror of infinite shapes and dread soul and messenger of the other gods, that the fungus moon beasts serve. And Carter thought of the black galley that had vanished when the tide of battle turned against the toad-like abnormalities on the jagged rock in the sea. Reflecting upon these things, he was staggering to his feet in the midst of his nightmare company, when there rang without warning through that pale-litten and limitless chamber the hideous blast of a daemon trumpet. 3 times pealed that frightful brazen scream, and when the echoes of the third blast had died chuckling away, Randolph Carter saw that he was alone. Whither, why, and how the ghouls and nightgaunts had been snatched from sight was not for him to divine. He knew only that he was suddenly alone, and that whatever unseen powers lurked mockingly around him were no powers of Earth's friendly dreamland. Presently from the chamber's uttermost reaches, a new sound came. This, too, was a rhythmic trumpeting, but of a kind far removed from the 3 raucous blasts which had dissolved his goodly cohorts. In this low fanfare echoed all the wonder and melody of ethereal dream, exotic vistas of unimagined loveliness floating from each strange chord and subtly alien cadence. Odors of incense came to match the golden notes, and overhead a great light dawned, its colors changing in cycles unknown to Earth's spectrum, and following the song of the trumpets in weird symphonic harmonies. Torches flared in the distance, and the beat of drums throbbed nearer amidst waves of tense expectancy. Out of the thinning mists and cloud of strange incenses filed twin columns of giant black slaves with loincloths of iridescent silk. Upon their heads were strapped vast helmet-like torches of glittering metal, from which the fragrance of obscure balsams spread in fumous spirals. In their right hands were crystal wands whose tips were carven into leering chimeras, while their left hands grasped long, thin silver trumpets, which they blew in turn. Armlets and anklets of gold they had, and between each pair of anklets stretched a golden chain that held its wearer to a sober gait. That they were true black men of Earth's dreamland was at once apparent, but it seemed less likely that their rites and costumes were wholly things of our Earth. 10 feet from Carter, the columns stopped, and as they did so, each trumpet flew abruptly to its bearer's thick lips. Wild and ecstatic was the blast that followed, and wilder still the cry that chorused just after, from dark throats somehow made shrill by strange artifice. Then, down the wide lane betwixt the two columns, a lone figure strode, a tall, slim figure, with the young face of an antique pharaoh, gay with prismatic robes, and crowned with a golden skint that glowed with inherent light. Close up to Carter strode that regal figure, whose proud carriage and smart features had in them the fascination of a dark god or fallen archangel, and around whose eyes there lurked the languid sparkle of capricious humor. It spoke, and in its mellow tones there rippled the wild music of Lethean streams. "Randolph Carter," said the voice, "you have come to see the great ones whom it is unlawful for men to see. Watchers have spoken of this thing, and the other gods have grunted as they rolled and tumbled mindlessly to the sound of thin flutes in the black, ultimate void where broods the daemon sultan, whose name no lips dare speak aloud. When Barzai the Wise climbed Hathag-Kia to see the great ones dance and howl above the clouds in the moonlight, he never returned. The other gods were there, and they did what was expected. Zenig of Afarat sought to reach unknown Kadath in the cold waste, and his skull is now set in a ring on the little finger of one whom I need not name. But you, Randolph Carter, have braved all things of Earth's dreamland, and burn still with the flame of quest. You came not as one curious, but as one seeking his due, nor have you failed ever in reverence toward the mild gods of earth. Yet have these gods kept you from the marvelous sunset city of your dreams, and wholly through their own small covetousness, for verily they craved the weird loveliness of that which your fancy had fashioned, and vowed that henceforward no other spot should be their abode. They are gone from their castle on unknown Kadath to dwell in your marvelous city. All through its palaces of veined marble they revel by day, and when the sun sets, they go out in the perfumed gardens and watch the golden glory on temples and colonnades, arched bridges and silver-basined fountains, and wide streets with blossom-laden urns, and ivory statues in gleaming rows. And when night comes, They climb tall terraces in the dew, and sit on carved benches of porphyry, scanning the stars, or lean over pale balustrades to gaze at the town's steep northward slopes, where one by one the little windows in old peaked gables shine softly out with the calm yellow light of homely candles. The gods love your marvelous city, and walk no more in the ways of the gods. They have forgotten the high places of earth and the mountains that knew their youth. The earth has no longer any gods that are gods, and only the other ones from outer space hold sway on unremembered Kadath. Far away in a valley of your own childhood, Randolph Carter, play the heedless great ones. You have dreamed too well, O wise dreamer, for you have drawn dreams' gods away from the world of all men's visions to that which is wholly yours, having builded out of your boyhood's small fancies a city more lovely than all the phantoms that have gone before. It is not well that earth's gods leave their thrones for the spider to spin on, and their realm for the others to sway in the dark manner of others. Fain would the powers from outside bring chaos and horror to you, Randolph Carter, who are the cause of their upsetting, but that they know it is by you alone that the gods may be sent back to their world. And that half-waking dreamland which is yours, no power of uttermost night may pursue, and only you can send the selfish great ones gently out of your marvelous sunset city, back through the northern twilight to their wonted place atop unknown Kadath in the cold waste. So, Randolph Carter, in the name of the other gods, I spare you, and charge you to seek that sunset city which is yours, and to send thence the drowsy truant gods for whom the dream world waits. Not hard to find is that rosial fever of the gods, that fanfare of supernal trumpets and clash of immortal cymbals, that mystery whose place and meaning have haunted you through the halls of waking and the gulfs of dreaming, and tormented you with hints of vanished memory and the pain of lost things awesome and momentous. Not hard to find is that symbol and relic of your days of wonder, for truly it is but the stable and eternal gem, wherein all that wanders sparkles, crystallized to light your evening path. Behold, it is not over unknown seas, but back over well-known years that your quest must go, back to the bright, strange things of infancy, and the quick sun-drenched glimpses of magic that old scenes brought to wide, young eyes. For know you that your gold and marble city of wonder is only the sum of what you have seen and loved in youth. It is the glory of Boston's hillside roofs and western windows aflame with sunset, of the flower-fragrant common, and the great dome on the hill, and the tangle of gables and chimneys in the violet valley, where the many-bridged Charles flows drowsily. These things you saw, Randolph Carter, when your nurse first wheeled you out in the springtime, and they will be the last things you will ever see with eyes of memory and of love. And there is antique Salem, with its brooding years, and spectral Marblehead scaling its rocky precipices into past centuries, and the glory of Salem's towers and spires seen afar from Marblehead's pastures, across the harbor, against the setting sea. There is Providence quaint and lordly on its its 7 hills over the blue harbor, with terraces of green leading up to steeples and citadels of living antiquity, and Newport climbing wraith-like from its dreaming breakwater. Arkham is there with its moss-grown gambrel roofs, and the rocky rolling meadows behind it, and antediluvian Kingsport hoary with stacked chimneys and deserted quays and overhanging gables, and the marvel of high cliffs, and the milky misted ocean with tolling buoys beyond. Cool vales in Concord, cobbled lands in Portsmouth, twilight bends of rustic New Hampshire roads, where giant elms half hide white farmhouse walls and creaking well sweeps, Gloucester's salt wharves and Juro's windy willows, vistas of distant steepled towns and hills beyond hills along the north shore, hushed stony slopes and low ivied cottages in the lee of huge boulders in Rhode Island's back country, scent of the sea and fragrance of the fields spell the dark woods and joy of the orchards and gardens at dawn. These, Randolph Carter, are your city, for they are yourself. New England bore you, and into your soul she poured a liquid loveliness which cannot die. This loveliness, molded, crystallized, and polished by years of memory and dreaming, is your terraced wonder of elusive sunsets. And to find that marble parapet with curious urns and carven rail, and ascend at last these endless balustraded steps to the city of broad squares and prismatic fountains, you need only to turn back to the thoughts and visions of your wistful boyhood. Look, through that window shine the stars of eternal night. Even now they are shining above the scenes you have known and cherished, drinking of their charm that they may shine more lovely over the gardens of dream. There is Antares. He is winking at this moment over the roofs of Tremont Street, and you could see him from your window on Beacon Hill. Out beyond those stars yawn the gulfs from whence my mindless masters have sent me. Some day you too may traverse them, but if you are wise, you will beware such folly. For of those mortals who have been and returned, only one preserves a mind unshattered by the pounding, clawing horrors of the void. Terrors and blasphemies gnaws at one another for space, and there is more evil in the lesser ones than in the greater, even as you know from the deeds of those who sought to deliver you into my hands, whilst I myself harbored no wish to shatter you, and would indeed have helped you hither long ago, had I not been elsewhere busy, and certain that you would find yourself the way. Shun then the outer hells, and stick to the calm, lovely things of your youth. Seek out your marvelous city, and drive thence the recreant great ones, sending them back gently to those scenes which are of their own youth, and which wait uneasy for their return. Easier even than the way of dim memory is the way I will prepare for you. See, there comes hither a monstrous shantak, led by a slave, who for your peace of mind had best kept invisible. Mount and be ready. There! Yagash the Black will help you on the scaly horror. Steer for the brightest star just south of the zenith. It is Vega, and in 2 hours you will be just above the terrace of your sunset city. Steer for it till you hear a far-off singing in the high aether. Higher than that lurks madness. So rein your shantak when the first note lures. Look then back to earth, and you will see shining the deathless altar flame of Ired Na from the sacred roof of a temple. That temple is your desiderate sunset city. So steer for it before you heed the singing and are lost. When you draw nigh the city, steer for the same high parapet whence of old you scanned the outspread glory, prodding the shantak till he cry aloud. That cry the great ones will hear, and know as they sit on their perfumed terraces, and there will come upon them such a homesickness that all of your city's wonders will not console them for the absence of Kadath's grim castle and the skit of eternal stars that crowns it. Then must you land amongst them with the shantak, and let them see and touch that noisome and hippocephalic bird, meanwhile discoursing to them of unknown Kadath, which you will have so lately left, and telling them how its boundless halls are lovely and unlighted, where of old they used to leap and revel in supernal radiance. And the shantak will talk to them in the manner of shantaks, but it will have no powers of persuasion beyond the recalling of elder days. Over and over must you speak to the wandering great ones of their home and youth, till at last they will weep and ask to be shown the returning path they have forgotten. Thereat can you loose the waiting shantak, sending him skyward with the homing cry of his kind, hearing which the great ones will prance and jump with antique mirth, and forthwith stride after the loathly bird in the fashion of gods, through the deep gulfs of heaven, to Kadath's familiar towers and domes. Then will the marvelous sunset city be yours to cherish and inhabit forever, and once more will earth's gods rule the dreams of men from their accustomed seat. Go now. The casement is open, and the stars await outside. Already your shantak wheezes and titters with impatience. Steer for Vega through the night, but turn when the singing sounds. Forget not this warning, lest horrors unthinkable suck you into the gulf of shrieking and ululent madness. Remember the other gods. They are great and mindless and terrible, and lurk in the outer voids. They are good gods to shun. Hey, Ashanta Nyech, you are off. Send back Earth's gods to their haunts on unknown Kadath, and pray to all space that you may never meet me in my 1,000 other forms. Farewell, Randolph Carter, and beware, for I am Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. And Randolph Carter, gasping and dizzy on the hideous shantak, shot screamingly into space toward the cold blue glare of Boreal Vega, looking but once behind him at the clustered and chaotic turrets of the onyx nightmare, wherein still glowed the lone lurid light of that window above the air and the clouds of Earth's dreamland. Great polypus horrors slid darkly past, and unseen bat wings beat multitudinous around him, but he still clung to the unwholesome mane of that loathly and hippocephalic scaled bird. The stars danced mockingly, almost shifting now and then to form pale signs of doom, that one might wonder one had not seen and feared before, and ever the winds of nether howled of vague blackness and loneliness beyond the cosmos. Then, through the glittering vault ahead, there fell a hush of portent, and all the winds in horror slunk away as night things slink before the dawn. Dribbling in waves that golden wisps of nebula made weirdly visible, there rose a timid hint of far-off melody, droning in faint chords that our own universe of stars knows not. And as that music grew, the Shantak raised its ears and plunged ahead, and Carter likewise bent to catch each lovely strain. It was a song, but not the song of any voice. Night and the spheres sang it, and it was old when space and Nyarlathotep and the other gods were born. Faster flew the Shantak, and lower bent the rider, drunk with the marvel of strange gulfs, and whirling in the crystal coils of outer magic. Then came too late the warning of the Evil One, the sardonic caution of the daemon legate who had bidden the seeker beware the madness of that song. Only to taunt had Nyarlathotep marked out the way to safety, and these truant gods whose steps he could so easily lead back at will. For madness and the void's wild vengeance are Nyarlathotep's only gifts to the presumptuous, and frantic though the rider strove to turn his disgusting steed, that leering, tittering Shantak coursed on impetuous and relentless, flapping its great slippery wings in malignant joy, and headed for those unhallowed pits whither no dreamers reach, that last amorphous blight of nethermost confusion where bubbles and blasphemes, at infinity's center, the mindless daemon Sultan Azathoth, whose name no lips dare to speak aloud. Unswerving and obedient to the foul legate's orders, that hellish bird plunged onward through shoals of shapeless lurkers and caperers in darkness, and vacuous herds of drifting entities that pawed and groped and pawed the nameless larvae of the other gods, that are like them blind and without mind and possessed of singular hungers and thirsts. Onward, unswerving and relentless, and tittering hilariously to watch the chuckling and hysterics into which the risen songs of night and the spheres had turned, that eldritch scaly monster bore its helpless rider, hurtling and shooting, cleaving the utmost rim and spanning the uttermost abysses, leaving behind the stars and the realms of matter, and darting meteor-like through stark formlessness toward those inconceivable, unlighted chambers beyond time, where an Azathoth gnaws shapeless and ravenous amidst the muffled, maddening beat of vile drums, and the thin, monotonous whine of accursed flutes. Onward, onward, through the screaming, cackling, and blackly populous gulfs, and then from some dim, blessed distance, there came an image and a thought to Randolph Carter the doomed. Too well had Nyarlathotep planned his mocking and his tantalizing, for he had brought up that which no gusts of icy terror could quite efface. Home, New England, Beacon Hill, the waking world. For know you that your gold and marble city of wonder is only the sum of what you have seen and loved in youth, the glory of Boston's hillside roofs and western windows aflame with sunset, of the flower-fragrant common and the great dome on the hill, and the tangle of gables and chimneys in the violet valley where the many-bridged Charles flows drowsily. This loveliness, molded, crystallized, and polished by years of memory and dreaming, is your terraced wonder of elusive sunsets. And to find that marbled parapet with curious urns and carven rail, and ascend at last those endless balustraded steps to the city of broad squares and prismatic fountains, you need only to turn back to the thoughts and visions of your wistful boyhood. Onward, onward, dizzily onward to ultimate doom through the blackness where sightless feelers pawed and slimy snouts jostled, and nameless things tittered and tittered and tittered. but the image and the thought had come, and Randolph Carter knew clearly that he was dreaming, and only dreaming, and that somewhere in the background the world of waking and the city of his infancy still lay. Words came again. You need only turn back to the thoughts and visions of your wistful boyhood. Turn, turn, blackness on every side. But Randolph Carter could turn. Thick through the rushing nightmare that clutched his senses, Randolph Carter could turn and move. He could move, and if he chose, he could leap off the evil shantak that bore him hurtlingly downward at the orders of Nyarlathotep. He could leap off and dare those depths of night that yawned interminably down, those depths of fear whose terrors yet could not exceed the nameless doom that lurked waiting at chaos' core. He could turn and move and leap. He could. He would. He would. He would. Off that vast hippocephalic abomination leaped the doomed and desperate dreamer, and down through endless voids of sentient blackness he fell. Aeons reeled, universes died and were born again. Stars became nebulae, and nebulae became stars, and still Randolph Carter fell through those endless voids of sentient blackness. Then, in the slow creeping course of eternity, the utmost cycle of the cosmos churned itself into another futile completion, and all things became again as they were unreckoned kalpas before. Matter and light were born anew as space once had known them, and comets, suns, and worlds sprang flaming into life, though nothing survived to tell that they had been and gone, been and gone, always and always, back to no first beginning. And there was a firmament again, and a wind, and a glare of purple lights in the eyes of the falling dreamer. There were gods, and presences, and wills, beauty, and evil, and the shrieking of noxious night robbed of its prey. For through the unknown ultimate cycle had lived a thought, and a vision of a dreamer's boyhood. And now there were remade a waking world and an old cherished city to body and to justify these things. Out of the void, Sungak the violet gas had pointed the way, and archaic Nodens was bellowing his guidance from unhinted deeps. Stars swelled to dawns, and dawns burst into fountains of gold, carmine, and purple, and still the dreamer fell. Cries rent the aether as ribbons of light beat back the fiends from outside, and hoary Nodens raised a howl of triumph when Nyarlathotep, close on his quarry, stopped, baffled by a glare that seared his formless, hunting horrors to gray dust. Randolph Carter had indeed descended at last the wide, marmoreal flights to his marvelous city, for he was come again to the fair New England world that had wrought him. So, to the organ chords notes of morning's myriad whistles, and dawn's blaze thrown dazzling through purple panes by the great gold dome of the State House on the hill. Randolph Carter leaped shoutingly awake within his Boston room. Birds sang in hidden gardens, and the perfume of trellised vines came wistful from arbors his grandfather had reared. Beauty and light glowed from classic mantel and carven cornice, and walls grotesquely figured, while a sleek black cat rose yawning from hearthside sleep that his master's start and shriek had disturbed. In vast infinities away, past the gate of deeper slumber, and the enchanted woods, and the garden lands in the Serenarian Sea, and the twilight reaches of Inquinac, the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep strode brooding into the onyx castle atop unknown Kadath in the cold waste, and taunted insolently the mild gods of earth, whom he had snatched abruptly from their scented revels in the marvelous sunset city. I think those of you who stuck around and enjoyed this, if you like this, do all the things. Like, comment, subscribe. If you think it's worth money, check out Patreon. Check out Stream Elements, linked in the description, where you can make a one-time donation if you don't want to do the subscriptive model of Patreon. If you think it's worth sharing, we have X, we have Instagram, we have TikTok, BitChute, and the Discord server, the threefold Edifactory. And no matter what, never miss your opportunities.